Treblinka II was not built to imprison. It was built to process. Hidden in a quiet forest northeast of Warsaw, far from major cities and roads, Treblinka II did not resemble the vast concentration camps many imagine when they think of the Holocaust. There were no sprawling factory complexes, no long-term barrack systems meant for labor, no industrial skyline. It was smaller, quieter, more efficient, and that was the point. Between July 1942 and October 1943, nearly 900,000 people were murdered here, most within hours of arrival. Treblinka II was part of Operation Reinhard, the Nazi plan to eliminate the Jewish population of occupied Poland. It functioned not as a prison but as a mechanism. Trains arrived. Deception began immediately. Orders were shouted calmly. Signs pointed toward baths and disinfection. Luggage was stacked. Clothing was sorted. Gold was extracted. Hair was cut. The system moved forward. Behind wooden fences and carefully planted trees, gas chambers operated out of sight. Bureaucracy replaced chaos. Schedules replaced conscience. Paperwork replaced humanity. Treblinka II was not designed for visibility. It was designed for disappearance. We examine how a killing center could operate with terrifying efficiency, and how ordinary systems were reshaped into instruments of annihilation. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters, and together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1, The Decision to Build a Killing Center. Treblinka II did not emerge suddenly from chaos. It was conceived within a system that had already been moving steadily toward extermination long before the first rail line was extended into the forest near the village of Treblinka. By the summer of 1942, the Nazi regime had transitioned from persecution and segregation to organized mass murder across occupied Eastern Europe. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 had unleashed mobile killing units, the Einsatzgruppen, whose shootings marked a grim escalation in violence. Yet even those massacres revealed what Nazi planners considered a problem. Mass shootings were logistically exhausting, psychologically burdensome for the perpetrators, and difficult to conceal at scale. The leadership of the SS sought something more controlled, more efficient, less visible. Out of this search emerged Operation Reinhard, the coordinated plan to eliminate the Jewish population of occupied Poland through purpose-built extermination camps. Treblinka II would become one of its central instruments. The decision to construct the camp was not driven by military necessity. It was administrative. By mid-1942, the Warsaw Ghetto held hundreds of thousands of Jews, confined, starved, and already decimated by disease. The Nazi authorities required a mechanism capable of absorbing massive deportations quickly. Treblinka II was chosen for its isolation near the existing Treblinka labor camp and its access to rail infrastructure that connected directly to Warsaw and other ghettos. The location was deliberate, remote enough to prevent scrutiny, yet connected enough to receive constant transports. Planning moved with bureaucratic precision. SS and police leaders coordinated land acquisition, fencing, rail spurs, barracks, and gas chamber construction under the supervision of men already experienced in earlier killing operations, including personnel who had participated in the T4 euthanasia program inside Germany. Their expertise in carbon monoxide gassing, deception tactics, and concealment would be transferred to this new site. Treblinka II was never meant to function as a conventional concentration camp. It was designed from its inception as a facility of rapid extermination. There would be no large labor sections, no long-term prisoner management beyond a small group forced to maintain operations. Its internal layout would reflect its purpose: a reception area for arrivals, a zone for undressing and confiscation of belongings, and a secluded killing area hidden behind wooden fencing and camouflage. The camp would be divided into sections to separate process from outcome, to prevent incoming victims from seeing the end of the path. Even before the first deportation train arrived in July 1942, the conceptual framework was complete. The system required trains, guards, administrative records, and strict discipline among the staff. The architecture of Treblinka II would embody deception. Signs would direct arrivals to showers. Luggage would be tagged. Announcements would promise resettlement. Every element was engineered to maintain order for as long as possible. Chaos was inefficient. Panic slowed throughput. The planners understood that psychological control was as vital as physical force. By constructing a controlled narrative of transit and hygiene, the SS ensured that transports could be processed swiftly. Behind this calculated calm lay the true function of the camp. Fixed gas chambers powered initially by engine exhaust, later expanded to increase capacity. Construction was rushed in the early months, and initial operations were marked by dysfunction and disorder, revealing that even systems built for killing required refinement. But the intent was clear from the beginning. Treblinka II was not improvisation. It was policy materialized. Within weeks, deportations from Warsaw began on an unprecedented scale, tens of thousands per month, the camp operating as a terminal point in a logistical chain that began in ghetto streets and ended in concealed burial pits. The decision to build Treblinka II illustrates how genocide became administrative routine. It required surveyors to measure land, carpenters to build barracks, railway officials to schedule trains, clerks to record numbers, and officers to supervise order. Each task appeared bureaucratic. Each step seemed procedural. Together, they formed a mechanism whose purpose was annihilation. The creation of Treblinka II demonstrates how ideology translated into infrastructure. Anti-Jewish doctrine provided the justification. Engineers and administrators supplied the method. By the time the first transports rolled toward the clearing in the forest, the camp was ready to function not as a prison, but as a processing center for death. And in that readiness lay the most unsettling truth. Treblinka II was not the product of chaos or battlefield fury. It was the outcome of deliberate planning, structured command, and a system that had already decided that certain lives would be reduced to entries in a schedule. The forest near Treblinka would soon conceal one of the most lethal operations of the Holocaust, but in its beginning, it appeared simply as another construction project on a railway map, another administrative site within a vast empire of occupation. The machinery had been assembled. All that remained was for the trains to arrive. Chapter 1, Segment 2. The camp takes shape in the forest. When construction crews arrived in the wooded clearing near the small railway halt of Treblinka in early 1942, the landscape revealed little of what it would soon conceal. The forest was dense, the ground uneven, the nearest villages quiet and rural. That isolation was intentional. Treblinka II was positioned far from major population centers, yet strategically connected by rail to Warsaw and other ghettos across occupied Poland. The railway line became the artery through which the system would breathe. From the very beginning, the camp's physical design reflected its singular purpose: speed, separation, and secrecy. Unlike camps built for incarceration and labor, Treblinka II required no extensive industrial facilities, no long-term housing for large prisoner populations. Instead, it required controlled zones that would guide arrivals from train platform to gas chamber with minimal resistance and maximum efficiency. The first structures were rudimentary: wooden barracks for SS personnel and auxiliary guards, fencing, watchtowers, and a reception area built to resemble a transit station. The deception began with architecture. A fake clock, painted signs, and a facade suggesting order and relocation were integrated into the entrance area. Victims were meant to believe they had arrived at a temporary processing center before resettlement in the east. The camp was divided into distinct sections, often referred to as zones, each carefully shielded from the others by high fences made of barbed wire intertwined with branches. These visual barriers prevented newly arrived deportees from seeing the killing area. The first zone included the unloading ramp and a square where deportees were assembled. From there, they were directed toward undressing barracks under the pretense of disinfection. A path, later known by survivors as the Tube, connected this area to the extermination zone. It was narrow, enclosed, and designed to keep victims moving forward without seeing what lay ahead. Construction was overseen by SS officers who had previous experience in the T4 euthanasia program, where stationary gas chambers had been used to kill disabled Germans. Their knowledge of carbon monoxide gassing was transferred to Treblinka. The initial gas chambers were small, improvised structures powered by engine exhaust redirected into sealed rooms. Early operations revealed mechanical problems and congestion, but rather than reconsider the project, the SS expanded capacity. Larger, more permanent gas chambers were built, increasing throughput dramatically. Burial pits were dug by forced laborers in anticipation of the bodies that would soon arrive in numbers beyond imagination. The camp staff was relatively small, a few dozen German SS men supplemented by several hundred Traniki-trained auxiliary guards, many recruited from Soviet POW camps. This small force relied on discipline, terror, and routine to control thousands arriving daily. The architecture itself became a weapon. Confined spaces, narrow corridors, and controlled sight lines reduced the likelihood of coordinated resistance. The design ensured that victims remained unaware of the full reality until it was too late. Administrative structures were also established. Offices recorded transport numbers. Confiscated belongings were sorted, catalogued, and prepared for shipment back into the Reich. Treblinka II functioned not only as a killing site but as a node in a wider economic network that recycled property stripped from the dead. Clothing, jewelry, currency, and even hair were collected systematically. Efficiency demanded order. Even as murder became the primary objective, paperwork and scheduling remained constant. By July 1942, as deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto began on a massive scale, the camp's physical form was largely complete. Trains could arrive directly at the ramp. Guards could surround the platform. The process could unfold within hours. The isolation of the forest reduced outside observation, yet smoke, stench, and the movement of trains did not go entirely unnoticed by nearby residents. Still, the secrecy of the operation was maintained through intimidation and misinformation. Treblinka II's construction reveals how genocide required infrastructure as much as ideology. Lumber had to be cut, foundations laid, engines installed. Each task was performed by laborers, some German, some forced, who may have seen only fragments of the whole. Yet together, those fragments formed a structure optimized for extermination. The camp did not need monumental buildings. It needed concealment and flow. In a matter of months, the clearing in the forest transformed into a mechanism capable of processing thousands of human beings per day. The calm rural setting masked the industrial character of what had been built. By the time the first large transports began arriving in late July 1942, Treblinka II stood ready, not as a prison, not as a labor colony, but as a facility whose architecture served a single end. The forest that once held silence would soon hold burial pits, smoke, and the relentless rhythm of trains. The camp had taken shape. The system was now prepared to operate at scale. Chapter 1, Segment 3, The First Transports and the System in Motion. By late July 1942, the machinery of Treblinka II moved from preparation to operation, and the forest clearing that had been shaped by saws and shovels began to receive its human cargo in relentless waves. The first major deportations came from the Warsaw Ghetto as part of Operation Reinhard, and trains packed far beyond capacity rolled toward the small station at Treblinka, each carriage sealed, airless, and already heavy with exhaustion, fear, and confusion. When the doors were opened, guards shouted orders in German and Polish, dogs barked, rifle butts struck wood and bone, and the illusion of resettlement was enforced with speed. The arrival procedure followed a strict sequence. Men, women, and children were forced from the wagons and assembled on the platform, surrounded by armed personnel to prevent panic or escape. An SS officer or interpreter would announce that they had reached a transit camp where they would undergo disinfection before labor in the East. The message was crafted to maintain control. Deception reduced resistance. Luggage was to be left behind and labeled. Valuables were to be surrendered. Those who appeared sick or unable to walk were separated under the pretense of medical attention. But in reality they were led directly to execution pits. The rest were driven into the reception square where orders came rapidly and without pause. Men were separated from women and children. Clothing was to be removed quickly. Hair of women was cut. The pace was relentless, designed to overwhelm the senses and prevent reflection. Once undressed, victims were forced into the narrow fenced corridor known as the tube, a path screened by branches and barbed wire that prevented any view of the extermination zone. Guards positioned along the route maintained pressure with whips and shouts, ensuring constant movement forward. At the end of that path stood the gas chamber building, its exterior plain and unremarkable. Inside, rooms were packed tightly with as many people as could fit. The doors were sealed. An engine, often taken from a tank or truck, was started outside. Carbon monoxide exhaust was channeled through pipes into the chambers. Within minutes, oxygen thinned and breathing became impossible. The process was mechanical, repetitive, and timed. When the engine was stopped and the doors opened, work prisoners assigned to the Sonderkommando entered to remove the bodies. Teeth were searched for gold. Corpses were dragged to burial pits. The chambers were cleaned for the next group. All of this occurred within a cycle measured not in days but in hours. The small staff of German SS officers relied heavily on auxiliary guards and prisoner labor to maintain throughput. Administrative personnel recorded the number of transports, the estimated number of deportees, and shipments of confiscated goods. Clothing was sorted by size and type. Jewelry and currency were inventoried. Even at this early stage, the system emphasized efficiency and concealment. Burial pits, initially sufficient, soon proved inadequate as the volume of killing expanded dramatically during the Warsaw deportations. Smoke and odor began to spread beyond the camp perimeter, yet the remote location and climate of fear limited external interference. The early weeks exposed logistical problems. Engines malfunctioned, overcrowding caused delays, bodies accumulated faster than pits could be dug. But instead of slowing operations, the camp command adjusted procedures. Larger gas chambers were constructed to increase capacity. Work details were reorganized to speed removal and burial. Violence intensified to maintain discipline among prisoners forced to assist in the process. Treblinka II's transformation from construction site to operational extermination center was swift and deliberate. In a matter of days, the theoretical design of the camp proved capable of destroying entire communities. The system did not rely on spontaneous cruelty alone. It relied on coordination, timing, and obedience. Trains arrived according to schedule. Engines ran on command. Guards followed established routines. The forest, once quiet, echoed with the rhythm of arrivals and departures. Few who entered through the platform gates would leave alive. The vast majority were murdered within hours of arrival, their names unrecorded within the camp itself, reduced to numbers in transport lists that disappeared into bureaucratic archives. As summer progressed into autumn, Treblinka II operated at a scale that shocked even some within the Nazi apparatus. Thousands were killed daily during peak deportation periods. Entire neighborhoods of Warsaw vanished into the forest. Yet outwardly, the camp maintained its facade of transit and processing. There were no long lines of barracks filled with inmates, no visible population sustaining itself over months. Instead, there was constant turnover, arrival, undressing, gassing, burial, repeated with industrial rhythm. In these first months, Treblinka II revealed the terrifying clarity of its purpose. It was not improvisation, it was implementation. The system had moved into motion, and once in motion, it would not stop until hundreds of thousands had passed through its gates. Chapter 2, Segment 1: The Architecture of Deception and Control. Treblinka II was not designed as a chaotic killing field. It was constructed as a controlled environment in which deception functioned as the first weapon, and structure reinforced silence, speed, and obedience at every stage of the process. By the late summer of 1942, the camp's layout had evolved into a carefully segmented system divided into 3 primary zones: the reception area, the living and administrative quarters, and the extermination zone, each separated by fencing, barbed wire, and visual barriers made from pine branches woven tightly into the wire so that no prisoner could see beyond the section assigned to them. The railway spur led directly into the reception area, where a false train station facade reinforced the illusion of relocation. Signs indicated connections to other destinations, and a painted clock hung above the platform as if normal transit operations were underway. This calculated normalcy was critical because confusion slowed resistance, and resistance slowed killing. From the unloading ramp, deportees were driven toward a square that functioned as a sorting ground, where loud commands were delivered by SS men or interpreters who insisted that everyone would undergo disinfection before labor assignments. The language of hygiene, baths, and work served a dual purpose. It maintained order and masked intent. Luggage was stacked methodically in designated zones, later to be opened, searched, and sorted by prisoner labor details. Valuables were extracted and stored in warehouses, then shipped to Germany as part of the Reich's systematic plunder. Beyond the reception area lay the tube, a narrow fenced pathway that curved slightly, preventing any clear line of sight to the gas chambers. The design eliminated spatial awareness. Those walking the corridor could not judge distance, could not see the end point, and could not fully understand what awaited them. Guards stationed along the tube enforced continuous movement, ensuring that groups did not pause long enough to question or organize resistance. At the end of the tube stood the gas chamber building, initially modest in size but expanded within months to accommodate higher killing capacity. Its exterior bore no obvious sign of its function. The chambers were constructed with heavy wooden doors that could be sealed tightly, and pipes connected the interior to an engine positioned outside. Carbon monoxide from the engine was fed directly into the chambers, displacing oxygen until suffocation occurred. The system did not require complex technology. It required enclosure, pressure, and timing. Work prisoners assigned to corpse removal operated under extreme coercion. They were forced to untangle bodies, extract gold teeth, search hair and clothing for hidden valuables, and transport corpses to burial pits. These pits were dug with precision, deep and wide enough to accommodate thousands, yet even they eventually proved insufficient as deportations intensified. The administrative section of Treblinka II maintained records of transports, quantities of confiscated goods, and logistical needs such as fuel for engines or tools for burial. Orders traveled down a chain of command that emphasized discipline and secrecy. German SS officers oversaw operations, while auxiliary guards maintained perimeter security and assisted in movement control. Prisoner labor units were rotated and often executed to eliminate witnesses, reinforcing an atmosphere of constant fear and expendability. The architectural logic of Treblinka II was not merely physical but psychological. Every barrier, every corner of fencing, every staged announcement was intended to fragment knowledge. A prisoner unloading luggage did not see the gas chambers. A worker cleaning the chambers did not witness the unloading ramp. Segmentation reduced the chance that anyone could fully comprehend the system's entirety while still alive. The camp's small size compared to other concentration camps was intentional. It limited visible evidence and maximized turnover. There were no sprawling prisoner populations housed for years. Instead, the camp functioned as a swift conduit from arrival to death. Efficiency depended on rhythm. Trains arrived according to schedule coordinated with deportation offices in occupied territories. Sorting teams prepared storage space in advance. Gas chambers were cleared quickly between cycles. The design minimized idle time because idle time threatened order. In this structure, bureaucracy and brutality merged seamlessly. Clerks counted shipments of clothing while guards beat those who hesitated. Engines were serviced and refueled with the same routine attention given to military vehicles elsewhere in the Reich. The physical arrangement of Treblinka II revealed the logic of Operation Reinhard. Concealment, speed, extraction of valuables, and elimination of witnesses. It was a camp that functioned less as a prison and more as a mechanism, each component aligned toward a single outcome. By understanding its architecture, one begins to understand how mass murder could be systematized within ordinary frameworks of planning and organization. The buildings themselves were simple. The materials were basic. Yet the layout transformed those simple structures into instruments of unprecedented destruction. Treblinka II's architecture was not accidental. It was deliberate, refined, and repeatedly adjusted to increase capacity and reduce resistance. In this carefully arranged landscape of fences, corridors, and chambers, the illusion of order masked the certainty of death, and the forest beyond the barbed wire concealed a system that operated with terrifying regularity. Chapter 2, Segment 2: The Arrival Process and the Machinery of Movement. The true efficiency of Treblinka II was revealed not only in its buildings, but in the choreography of arrival, a sequence of movements so tightly controlled that thousands could pass through the camp in a single day with almost no interruption to the system's rhythm. When a transport train approached, it did not enter chaos. It entered preparation. Guards were already positioned. Labor detachments stood ready. The unloading ramp was cleared of previous belongings. Even the engine that powered the gas chambers was checked and prepared in advance because timing was everything. The train cars would grind to a halt inside the fenced spur, hidden from the outside world by trees and camouflage, and immediately the shouting would begin. Doors were forced open. Those inside, already weakened by days without adequate water, air, or sanitation, stumbled into blinding daylight. The shock was deliberate. Confusion prevented organization. Orders were delivered quickly, often in German and Polish, sometimes in other languages depending on the origin of the deportees. Men were separated from women and children under the pretense of labor classification. The elderly and the sick were directed elsewhere, told they would receive medical attention. The language used at this stage was carefully selected: resettlement, bath, disinfection, work. Each word functioned as a temporary shield against panic. A crowd that believed it still had a future could be controlled. Immediately after separation, deportees were forced to surrender luggage. Suitcases were stacked neatly, often labeled with chalk to give the impression they would be returned later. Prisoners assigned to sorting details worked under watchful eyes, removing valuables, separating clothing, and transferring everything to storage barracks. Gold, currency, jewelry, all were catalogued and prepared for shipment to Germany. Even in the midst of extermination, economic extraction remained a priority. Meanwhile, Another group of prisoners directed the new arrivals toward the undressing area. There, they were instructed to remove clothing quickly and fold it in ordered piles. The presence of signs indicating showers or bathhouses reinforced the deception. Women were sometimes told to cut their hair for hygiene reasons. Later, that hair would be collected and stored for industrial use. Guards monitored the pace. Delay could disrupt the entire schedule. From the undressing yard, naked prisoners were pushed toward the entrance of the tube, the narrow, camouflaged corridor leading to the gas chambers. Its design ensured that no one could see the final destination. The pathway curved slightly and was lined with high fencing interwoven with branches. The forest seemed to swallow those who entered. Shouting, dogs, and blows maintained speed. Resistance was met with immediate violence, not because of anger, but because efficiency demanded it. At the end of the corridor stood the gas chamber building. Prisoners were forced inside in tightly packed groups. Doors were sealed. Outside, an engine was started, often a captured tank or truck engine repurposed for killing. Carbon monoxide filled the chambers. Inside, panic replaced confusion. But from the outside, the process remained mechanical. Guards waited a calculated amount of time before reopening the doors. Work prisoners then entered to remove bodies, disentangle limbs, and clear the chamber for the next group. The removal process was brutal and physically exhausting, yet it was integrated into the camp schedule with the same precision as unloading the trains. Bodies were transported initially to mass graves dug in sandy soil. Later, as decomposition created both practical and concealment problems, corpses were exhumed and burned on open-air pyres constructed from railway tracks laid over concrete supports. Flames and smoke rose above the trees, visible at times from surrounding villages. Yet the machinery of movement did not stop. As one transport was processed, preparations for the next were already underway. Administrative personnel recorded numbers. Trains received, wagons emptied, valuables collected. No comprehensive death lists were maintained for victims. Their names were replaced by quantities. The system did not require documentation of individuals, only of throughput. The arrival process at Treblinka II thus functioned as a conveyor belt, with each stage designed to eliminate hesitation. Deception reduced resistance. Segmentation reduced awareness. Violence enforced speed. Economic plunder accompanied extermination. In this way, the camp transformed human beings into a sequence of movements, from train to ramp, from ramp to square, from square to undressing yard, from yard to tube, from tube to chamber. The physical space compressed time. A transport that arrived in the morning could be entirely processed by afternoon. There were no long-term barracks for most victims, no prolonged detention. The design erased the interval between arrival and death. This was not spontaneous brutality. It was organized motion. Every person involved, from the guard shouting orders to the clerk counting confiscated rings, occupied a defined role within that motion. And because the process relied on repetition, it gained momentum. What began as an operation expanded into routine. Treblinka II did not simply kill. It moved, sorted, stripped, suffocated, cleared, and prepared again. The rhythm of trains dictated the rhythm of death, and the machinery of movement ensured that the system could operate with terrifying continuity until the very end. Chapter 2, Segment 3, The Gas Chambers and the System of Erasure. At the far end of the tube, beyond the camouflage fencing and the shouts that drove people forward, stood the structure that defined Treblinka II more than any other. The gas chambers themselves, not monumental buildings, not towering industrial complexes, but compact, functional rooms designed for repetition, concealment, and speed. The first gas chamber building was relatively small, constructed of brick and concrete, divided into several chambers with airtight doors that could be sealed from the outside. When transports increased during the summer of 1942, this structure proved insufficient. Delays disrupted the schedule, and delays meant trains waiting on sidings, crowds gathering in confusion, and visible evidence of what the camp truly was. So the SS expanded the killing capacity. A larger gas chamber building was erected, containing more chambers and allowing multiple groups to be processed simultaneously. The redesign reflected a core principle of Treblinka's operation: adaptation for efficiency. The chambers were disguised externally as bathhouses. There were false showerheads mounted inside to maintain the illusion until the final moment. Once a group was forced inside, guards pushed bodies tightly together, maximizing the number of people per square meter. Doors were bolted. Outside, a motor engine, often described by survivors as a heavy diesel or tank engine, was started. Its exhaust was diverted through pipes into the sealed rooms. Carbon monoxide filled the space, gradually displacing breathable air. The process could take 20 to 30 minutes. Inside, panic turned to suffocation. But the mechanics outside followed a predictable rhythm. Guards listened for silence. When they judged the process complete, they opened the doors. What followed was not improvisation but assignment. Special prisoner units, themselves facing near certain death after short periods of forced labor, were ordered to remove the bodies. They disentangled limbs, pulled corpses free from one another, and searched mouths for hidden gold teeth. Dentists among the prisoners were forced to extract gold fillings with pliers. Women's hair was cut and bundled. Rings, watches, and concealed valuables were confiscated. Even in death, the system extracted economic value. The bodies were then transported initially to large burial pits dug within the camp's perimeter. These pits were enormous trenches in sandy soil, layered with corpses. Lime was sometimes scattered to reduce odor and accelerate decomposition, but the scale soon overwhelmed these measures. As the number of victims grew into the hundreds of thousands, decomposition created both logistical and concealment problems. The stench spread. Groundwater contamination became evident. Rumors reached surrounding communities. In response, orders came to exhume and burn the bodies. This phase, often referred to as part of Action 1005, was intended to erase evidence of mass murder across occupied territories. At Treblinka II, prisoners were forced to reopen mass graves. Bodies, many already decomposed, were stacked onto open-air pyres constructed from railway tracks placed atop concrete supports. Wood was arranged beneath and between layers of corpses. Fuel was added. The fires burned continuously. Ash and bone fragments were later crushed and scattered, sometimes mixed into soil or dumped into nearby fields and rivers. The aim was total erasure not only of individuals but of scale. The gas chambers themselves were cleaned rapidly between groups. Water was thrown across floors. Blood and bodily fluids were swept away. The chambers were prepared again. Outside, the arrival ramp awaited the next train. This cycle, gas, clear, strip, burn, scatter, became the operational core of Treblinka II. It required coordination among guards, Ukrainian auxiliaries, and prisoner work details. It required record-keeping, fuel supply, maintenance of engines, and scheduled train arrivals. It required silence from those who knew and deception toward those who did not. And it functioned with alarming consistency. Unlike concentration camps where prisoners might remain for months or years, Treblinka's purpose eliminated duration. The majority of those who entered the gas chambers had been inside the camp for less than 2 hours. Their names were rarely recorded. Their belongings were catalogued more carefully than their identities. The administrative structure behind this killing center ensured that numbers were reported upward through SS channels. Reports listed transports received and valuables shipped. The language of these documents avoided direct reference to death. Euphemisms shielded perpetrators from confronting the reality of what they were managing. In this way, the gas chambers were both physical spaces and endpoints of a bureaucratic chain that began far beyond the camp, in offices that scheduled deportations, in railway departments that allocated freight cars, in ministries that defined entire populations as expendable. Treblinka II did not operate in isolation. It was the culmination of administrative decisions translated into architecture. And the gas chambers were not chaotic instruments of rage. They were engineered rooms within a system calibrated for throughput. Even when rumors of extermination began to spread, even when smoke rose visibly from the burning pits, the machinery continued because its operators understood their roles as tasks within a structure larger than themselves. By late 1943, when the camp was dismantled after a prisoner uprising, the gas chambers were destroyed, the ground plowed, and a farmhouse built to disguise the site. But the structural logic remained clear. Treblinka II demonstrated that genocide could be organized as a sequence of controlled environments. Arrival yard, undressing square, corridor, chamber, pit, pyre, each connected by a system that valued order above all else. The gas chambers were the most lethal element of that structure, yet they were only one part of a broader mechanism designed to ensure that murder could proceed without interruption, without record of individual loss, and, the perpetrators hoped, without trace. Chapter 3, Segment 1, Administration, Command, and the Machinery of Control. Treblinka II did not operate through chaos. It functioned through command, hierarchy, and administrative clarity, and to understand how the extermination process continued with such relentless regularity, one must examine the structure of authority that governed it from the top down. At the summit of this hierarchy stood the camp commandant, appointed by the SS and directly connected to the broader framework of Operation Reinhard. He was not merely a local overseer but a node in a chain of command that stretched to district authorities and ultimately to the central planners who designed the extermination program. Beneath him were officers responsible for specific sectors of the camp: the reception area, the gas chamber complex, the prisoner labor units, the storage and transport of confiscated property, and security coordination with auxiliary guards. This division of responsibility ensured that no single individual managed the entire process alone, yet each component was synchronized through daily briefings, written orders, and reports. The language used within this structure reflected bureaucratic detachment. Victims were described as units or transports. The arrival of thousands in a single day was recorded not as human displacement but as logistical fulfillment. Reports moved upward, listing numbers processed, valuables secured, clothing sorted, and shipments dispatched. In this way, Treblinka II became embedded within a documentation culture that transformed mass murder into measurable output. Surrounding the German SS Corps was a smaller contingent of Ukrainian auxiliaries, often recruited from prisoner of war camps, trained and deployed as perimeter guards and escorts within the killing process. Their role was crucial to maintaining intimidation and physical enforcement. Armed and positioned along the tube and around the camp boundaries, they ensured movement remained unidirectional. They prevented escape, suppressed resistance, and reinforced the illusion of order. While the number of SS personnel at Treblinka II remained relatively small compared to other large camps, the efficiency of the administrative design compensated for this. Control was achieved not through overwhelming numbers but through spatial organization and delegation. Within the camp itself, prisoner labor units, known as work details, were organized under strict supervision. These prisoners were separated from incoming transports and assigned specific tasks: sorting clothing, maintaining barracks, operating in the gas chamber clearing units, managing burial or burning operations, and performing repairs. They were housed separately and subject to constant surveillance, aware that their survival depended on compliance and that replacement could occur at any moment. The command structure relied on this rotation of laborers, periodically executing entire groups to prevent information leaks while selecting new workers from arriving transports. This practice both eliminated witnesses and reinforced terror among those temporarily spared. Orders flowed daily. Transport schedules arrived by rail telegram. Storage depots for seized property required inventory coordination. Gold and currency were packed and sent onward to designated collection points. Clothing was disinfected, sorted by type and quality, and shipped to the Reich for redistribution. Even hair cut from victims was bundled and dispatched for industrial use. Each of these actions required oversight. Each generated paperwork. Each reinforced the perception among administrators that they were managing resources rather than destroying lives. The camp's commandant maintained direct communication with superiors overseeing Operation Reinhard. Periodic inspections ensured that throughput targets were met and that discipline among personnel remained strict. Drunkenness, theft beyond permitted levels, or visible cruelty that disrupted operational flow could result in reprimand, not because of moral concern, but because disorder threatened efficiency. This distinction is critical. Violence at Treblinka II was routine, yet it was calibrated within an administrative logic. Random brutality that delayed trains or disrupted the processing sequence was discouraged. Structured brutality that accelerated compliance was encouraged. The camp's layout itself reinforced administrative control. Zones were divided clearly: living quarters for guards, reception area, undressing square, tube, gas chamber complex, and burial or burning grounds. Movement between zones required authorization. Guards were assigned fixed posts. Rotations were scheduled. This segmentation prevented confusion and allowed command to identify points of failure quickly. If transports backed up, responsibility could be traced. If valuables went missing, inventory discrepancies were investigated. Even within a killing center, accountability existed, but it was accountability for performance, not humanity. Beyond the camp perimeter, the integration of Treblinka II into railway systems required coordination with civil authorities. Trains departed from ghettos and transit camps according to timetables negotiated with German railway administrators. Freight cars were allocated. Routes were cleared. Delays were reported. This logistical web meant that the extermination functioned not as an isolated military action but as a collaborative infrastructure involving civilian agencies, regional officials, and central planners. Within Treblinka II, daily routines reinforced obedience. Roll calls for work details, inspections of facilities, maintenance of engines powering the gas chambers, and management of supplies such as fuel and construction materials were all part of the administrative rhythm. The machinery of death required maintenance like any industrial plant. When engines malfunctioned, repairs were prioritized. When burial pits reached capacity, new trenches were ordered. When evidence became too visible, directives for exhumation and burning were issued. These decisions were recorded, communicated, and executed through structured channels. The presence of hierarchy also distributed moral responsibility, allowing individuals to perceive their actions as compliance with orders rather than autonomous choices. The commandant implemented directives from above. Sector leaders enforced procedures below. Guards carried out physical tasks assigned. Clerks recorded numbers. This fragmentation of responsibility created psychological distance between action and consequence. No single administrator could claim ignorance of the outcome, yet each could point to the chain of command as justification. In examining Treblinka II's administrative system, one sees not spontaneous cruelty but institutional design. It was this design, the careful layering of authority, documentation, logistics, and spatial control, that allowed the camp to function at lethal capacity with limited personnel and within a relatively short operational lifespan. Between July 1942 and late 1943, hundreds of thousands were murdered there, and this scale was possible only because the camp's leadership embedded extermination within a structure of routine governance. Treblinka II stands as evidence that genocide can be organized not only through ideological fervor but through disciplined administration, where desks, telegraphs, schedules, and stamped forms become as essential to killing as guards and weapons. Chapter 3, Segment 2, Labor Units, Rotation, and the System of Disposable Witnesses. Treblinka II was constructed as a place of immediate death for the vast majority who arrived, yet paradoxically it depended on a constantly rotating population of prisoners kept alive temporarily to sustain the mechanics of extermination, and within this contradiction lay one of the camp's most chilling administrative strategies: the deliberate creation and destruction of forced labor units designed to operate the killing process while ensuring that no long-term witnesses survived. From each transport, a small number of men were selected upon arrival, often skilled workers such as tailors, barbers, carpenters, mechanics, or simply those judged physically strong enough to endure several weeks of brutal labor. These individuals were separated before the undressing stage and diverted into work details that served specific functions within the camp's internal economy. Some were assigned to the reception area to help unload trains, remove bodies from wagons when necessary, and clean the rail cars before they returned to the network. Others were stationed in the sorting barracks, where mountains of clothing, shoes, suitcases, and personal belongings were meticulously categorized by size, material, and perceived value. Jewelry and currency were collected separately, hidden compartments and luggage were searched, and garments were shaken out for concealed items. Even the smallest objects were cataloged, because everything extracted from the victims fed into the Reich's material recovery system. Another group operated closer to the killing zone itself. After gassing, designated prisoners opened chamber doors under guard supervision and carried out bodies for burial or, later, for burning when exhumation operations began. These laborers worked in suffocating conditions among corpses, performing tasks under strict time constraints to maintain throughput efficiency. Their existence illustrates how the extermination process required constant physical labor to sustain its pace. Without them, the machinery would stall. Yet their survival was never secure. The SS maintained a policy of periodic liquidation of work details, executing entire units and replacing them with new arrivals. This rotation ensured operational continuity while minimizing the accumulation of first-hand knowledge that might facilitate organized resistance or later testimony. Fear was therefore embedded not only in the violence inflicted on new transports but also in the daily reality of those temporarily spared. Every laborer understood that usefulness equaled postponement, not safety. Within the labor hierarchy, internal structure developed under coercion. Prisoners were assigned supervisory roles such as capos or foremen, positions that offered marginal privileges, slightly better rations, fewer beatings, or extended survival, in exchange for enforcing discipline within workgroups. This dynamic fractured solidarity and created tension, yet it also reflected the broader strategy of control through delegation. Guards did not need to monitor every movement directly. They relied on prisoners to regulate one another, reinforcing the camp's layered authority system. Housing for these labor units was separated from the arrival zone, forming a closed microsociety entirely enclosed by barbed wire and watchtowers. Contact with the outside world was non-existent. News arrived only through whispers from new transports, fragments of rumor about battles, or speculation about the war's direction. Within this isolation, prisoners navigated survival through cooperation, small acts of mutual assistance, and the exchange of information. Food rations were minimal, often consisting of thin soup and scraps, insufficient for sustaining health under grueling labor. Malnutrition weakened bodies quickly, reinforcing the replaceable nature of the workforce. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were removed and killed without ceremony, and replacements were drawn from the next arriving train. Over time, certain specialized roles emerged. Mechanics were required to maintain the engines used to generate lethal gases. Carpenters repaired structures and constructed additional barracks or fences. Tailors sorted and altered clothing for redistribution. Even hair cutting became institutionalized, with barbers shaving victims before gassing to streamline the process. Each task contributed to a system that prioritized speed and concealment. The compartmentalization of duties prevented any single prisoner from overseeing the entire operation, yet collectively they witnessed its totality. This collective awareness carried enormous psychological weight. Living amid constant death, forced to handle the physical aftermath of extermination, prisoners existed in a state of suspended horror. Some clung to the faint hope that survival might last until liberation. Others recognized the near inevitability of their eventual execution. The knowledge that work sustained the camp's killing rhythm created a moral burden layered atop physical suffering. The SS exploited this by maintaining unpredictability. Selections for execution could occur without warning. Entire barracks could be emptied overnight. The resulting atmosphere suppressed overt resistance for months. Yet it also cultivated quiet networks of trust among those who dared to imagine escape. It is important to understand that Treblinka II's labor system was not designed for long-term economic productivity like some concentration camps attached to industrial complexes. Its primary function was extermination, and labor existed solely to support that function. The workforce did not manufacture goods on a large scale. Instead, it facilitated the conversion of human arrivals into ash and sorted property. This distinction underscores Treblinka's role as a death factory rather than a labor colony. The rotation of laborers served both operational and security purposes. By periodically killing work units, the SS eliminated experienced witnesses while simultaneously reinforcing terror among remaining prisoners. It also prevented the formation of stable, cohesive communities that might challenge authority. Despite these measures, over time certain prisoners managed to establish clandestine communication networks, sharing intelligence about guard routines and vulnerabilities. These fragile connections would later contribute to organized revolt. But in this phase of the camp's operation, survival meant endurance within a system calibrated for disposability. Treblinka II's reliance on forced laborers reveals a structural contradiction at the heart of extermination camps. While intended to eliminate life rapidly, they depended on the temporary preservation of a few lives to function. This dependency required constant recalibration, enough prisoners alive to maintain operations, but not enough time or stability to allow sustained resistance. The labor units thus became both the engine and the evidence of the camp's design, embodying the intersection of administration, coercion, and calculated erasure that defined Treblinka II's existence. Chapter 3, Segment 3: Discipline, Surveillance, and the Illusion of Total Control. Treblinka II was engineered not only through fences, gas chambers, and administrative schedules, but through a carefully constructed atmosphere of psychological domination that made resistance appear impossible and obedience seem like the only rational response. And in this final dimension of its internal structure, the camp reveals how terror was systematized into daily routine through discipline, surveillance, and the calculated illusion of total control. From the moment a transport entered the reception area, order was enforced through shouting commands, physical blows, and the constant presence of armed guards positioned to dominate sightlines, creating an immediate understanding that every movement was observed and every hesitation punished. Yet beyond the violence itself lay a subtler architecture, one in which watchtowers, patrol paths, and internal barriers segmented the camp into controlled zones, ensuring that prisoners rarely saw beyond the boundaries of their assigned tasks and rarely grasped the full geography of the killing complex. The camp's triangular layout was divided into distinct sectors: the arrival square, the undressing barracks, the path leading to the gas chambers, the execution area, and the labor compound, each separated by fencing and natural obstacles, forcing both victims and workers into controlled corridors that minimized confusion for the guards and maximized disorientation for those trapped inside. Lighting was minimal but strategic. Searchlights scanned perimeters at night, reinforcing the sense that darkness offered no refuge. Dogs were used not only for tracking but for intimidation, their presence reinforcing the unpredictability of punishment. Discipline within prisoner labor units was maintained through a hierarchy that mirrored SS authority, with capos and block leaders enforcing speed quotas and behavioral compliance under threat of collective punishment. This layered system meant that control did not rely solely on direct SS oversight. Instead, fear was internalized and redistributed among prisoners themselves, turning survival into a precarious negotiation within the boundaries set by the camp's designers. Surveillance extended beyond physical observation into administrative tracking. Work assignments were recorded, labor outputs monitored, and prisoner counts conducted repeatedly each day to ensure no disappearance went unnoticed. Roll calls, though less ceremonial than in concentration camps focused on long-term detention, still functioned as ritual affirmations of power, forcing exhausted laborers to stand for extended periods while guards recalculated numbers. Any discrepancy triggered immediate searches and reprisals. The knowledge that escape attempts would result in execution of fellow prisoners reinforced collective restraint, embedding the principle of shared consequence deep into the camp psychology. Punishments were swift and public. Beatings occurred in visible areas to serve as deterrents. Executions were sometimes staged within sight of labor barracks, communicating that disobedience equaled instant death. Yet even these displays were regulated, integrated into the rhythm of operations so as not to disrupt throughput efficiency. Violence was not random chaos. It was calibrated enforcement. The SS cultivated unpredictability within a framework of routine, a combination that destabilized expectations while preserving operational stability. Guards rotated duties between zones, preventing familiarity that might soften brutality. Communication between sectors was restricted, ensuring that knowledge flowed vertically through command channels rather than horizontally among prisoners. Despite these measures, small breaches in control occurred: whispered conversations during sorting work, fleeting glances exchanged between barracks, fragments of overheard dialogue among guards, and these cracks would eventually widen into the planning of revolt. But during the period in which Treblinka II functioned at peak efficiency, the illusion of total surveillance remained largely intact. Even natural features were weaponized. Surrounding forests and uneven terrain were presented as insurmountable barriers, though in reality they offered concealment to the rare successful escapee. Minefields were rumored, sometimes real, sometimes exaggerated, further amplifying the perception that every boundary was lethal. Deception also reinforced control. Victims were told they were in transit to labor sites. Signs mimicked railway stations. Administrative language sanitized murder into resettlement procedures. For labor prisoners, promises of transfer or improved conditions dangled as distant possibilities, rarely fulfilled but effective in postponing despair. This manipulation of expectation kept many focused on immediate survival rather than coordinated resistance. The camp's internal order thus rested on three pillars: physical containment, hierarchical delegation, and psychological conditioning. Together they created an environment in which the majority of arrivals complied with instructions even in the face of mounting evidence of danger, and where labor units endured daily horror under the belief that individual defiance was futile. Yet the very need for such intensive discipline reveals underlying vulnerability. A system that depends on constant surveillance acknowledges the risk of disruption. A regime that rotates workers acknowledges the danger of accumulated knowledge. By examining Treblinka II's mechanisms of control, we see not only the brutality of its enforcement but also the fragile equilibrium sustaining it, a balance between fear and function, coercion and coordination. The camp operated because terror was organized, because every barrier, every command, every punishment was integrated into a coherent structure designed to prevent collapse from within. And yet, beneath that structure, human agency persisted, quietly observing, remembering, and waiting for an opportunity to challenge the illusion that the machinery of death was invincible. Chapter 4, Segment 1: The Gas Chambers and the Mechanics of Killing. At the heart of Treblinka II stood the installation that defined its purpose, a structure concealed behind fences and trees, separated from the arrival zone by a narrow, enclosed pathway, and designed with one singular function: the systematic murder of those transported there. And to understand how Treblinka operated with such terrifying efficiency, one must examine not only the existence of its gas chambers but the precise mechanics that allowed killing to become routine, scheduled, and industrial in scale. The path leading from the undressing barracks to the extermination area was deliberately constructed as a confined corridor, high fences woven with branches blocking visibility from either side, ensuring that those forced to walk it could neither see the chambers ahead nor the burial grounds beyond, a final stage in the architecture of deception that isolated victims from the truth until the last possible moment. At the end of this corridor stood a building initially modest in size, later expanded to accommodate greater numbers, constructed of brick and concrete, containing multiple sealed rooms equipped with heavy doors and airtight fittings. Unlike extermination centers that later adopted pesticide-based methods, Treblinka's killing process relied on carbon monoxide generated by a stationary engine, its exhaust redirected through pipes into the sealed chambers. This choice reflected both technical experimentation and logistical pragmatism, as the camp's designers sought a method that required minimal supplies yet could operate continuously throughout the day. The chambers were built to hold dozens, later hundreds at a time. Victims were forced inside under the pretense of disinfection or showering, doors bolted shut from the outside, and the engine activated, pumping lethal fumes into the confined space until silence replaced the sounds within. The duration varied depending on engine performance and chamber capacity, but the process was calculated for speed, allowing multiple cycles per transport and enabling the camp to eliminate thousands within a single day. After each cycle, a designated labor unit, prisoners compelled to handle the aftermath, entered to remove bodies, untangle limbs, and transport the dead to burial pits or later cremation sites, ensuring the chambers were cleared swiftly for the next group. This rotation of killing and clearing formed a rhythm, a mechanical cadence in which death was segmented into manageable intervals, each timed, repeated, and integrated into the broader schedule of arrivals. The initial phase of operations saw bodies buried in vast pits excavated nearby, trenches layered with corpses and covered with soil. However, as decomposition caused ground disturbances and odor spread, and as orders emerged to conceal evidence, the process shifted toward exhumation and open-air cremation, with bodies placed on grates constructed from railway tracks and burned to ash, a transformation that required additional labor but reduced visible traces. The design of the gas chamber complex reflected continual adaptation. Early inefficiencies prompted expansion, resulting in a larger facility capable of accommodating increased transport volumes during peak deportation periods. Engineers and administrators monitored throughput closely, adjusting chamber size and engine capacity to meet quotas determined by higher command. The building itself was deliberately plain, devoid of overt signage, hidden behind trees and fencing, separated from the arrival area by both distance and psychological barriers, ensuring that newly arrived victims would not witness the fate of those preceding them. Guards stationed along the corridor maintained speed and order, preventing hesitation, and any disruption was met with immediate violence to preserve momentum. The proximity of the burial and cremation grounds to the chambers minimized transport time for bodies, further enhancing efficiency. Even small details, the width of doorways, the arrangement of interior walls, the slope of floors for drainage, were considered in pursuit of smoother operation. And yet, for all its mechanical precision, The system depended on human enforcement at every stage. Guards forcing entry, operators managing the engine, labor prisoners removing bodies, administrators recording arrivals and presumed totals. Bureaucratic documentation masked the reality with euphemisms, but internally, reports focused on numbers processed rather than lives extinguished. Over time, the camp's killing infrastructure evolved into a self-contained cycle. Arrival, deception, confinement, gassing, removal, disposal, repetition. This cycle did not require elaborate technology. It required coordination, obedience, and adherence to routine. The sound of the engine starting became the signal that another group's fate had been sealed. Smoke rising from cremation pyres marked the end of that cycle and the preparation for the next. The isolation of the chamber area ensured that operations could proceed without interference from the arrival square, maintaining compartmentalization within the camp's layout. As deportations intensified, the gas chamber complex became the focal point of Treblinka's daily activity, its expansion mirroring the escalation of extermination policy across occupied territories. Yet even within this structure of calculated brutality, fragility existed. Mechanical failures delayed cycles, overcrowding risked suffocation before engine activation, and the need for constant clearing placed immense strain on labor units whose knowledge of the process deepened with each shift. The gas chambers were thus not merely rooms of death but nodes within a larger network of control, deception, and logistical coordination. By examining their mechanics, from the design of the corridor to the operation of the engine and the management of disposal, we confront the chilling reality that Treblinka's core function was achieved not through chaos but through method, a system in which killing was broken into stages, standardized, and integrated into the daily timetable of the camp, transforming mass murder into an operation governed by routine rather than impulse. Chapter 4, Segment 2, Burial Pits, Cremation Grates, and the Erasure of Evidence. Behind the gas chambers, beyond the final fenced boundary that few ever crossed alive, lay the area that revealed the true scale of Treblinka II's operation, the burial grounds and later the cremation sites, and it was here that the camp's administrators confronted a problem that would shape its next phase: how to dispose of thousands of bodies each day without leaving visible traces that could expose the magnitude of what was occurring. In the earliest months of operation, mass graves were excavated by forced labor units using basic tools, large trenches carved into the sandy soil of the forest clearing, designed to receive layer upon layer of corpses transported directly from the chambers. Bodies were laid in rows, sometimes sprinkled with quicklime in an attempt to hasten decomposition, then covered with earth, the ground smoothed to obscure immediate signs of disturbance. At first, this method appeared sufficient, as the camp's architects believed the site would remain operational only as long as deportations continued at peak intensity. However, as weeks turned into months and the volume of killing expanded, the limitations of burial became impossible to ignore. Decomposition caused the soil to shift and swell, gases rising from the pits producing visible distortions in the landscape and a stench that spread beyond the camp's perimeter, threatening both secrecy and sanitation. Reports from other extermination sites indicated similar challenges, and by late 1942 directives were issued to eliminate existing graves and transition toward large-scale cremation to eradicate evidence of earlier burials. This shift marked a significant transformation in Treblinka's operational design, as it required not only new infrastructure but also the reopening of mass graves, forcing prisoner labor units to exhume bodies in advanced stages of decay, a process that intensified both physical and psychological torment. Railway tracks were repurposed into makeshift grates supported by concrete blocks, forming platforms capable of holding hundreds of corpses at once. Beneath these grates, fires were fueled with wood and additional combustible materials, creating open-air cremation pyres that burned continuously. The arrangement allowed air to circulate beneath the bodies, increasing combustion efficiency, while camp personnel supervised the stacking process to maximize density and speed. Cremation cycles were coordinated with the rhythm of the gas chambers, ensuring that disposal did not fall behind killing. Ash and bone fragments were later crushed and scattered across the grounds or mixed into the soil, further obscuring physical traces. The transition from burial to cremation was not merely technical but strategic, reflecting a broader directive to erase evidence in anticipation of future scrutiny, particularly as news of mass shootings and extermination began to circulate in occupied territories. Treblinka thus entered a phase where concealment became as central to its function as killing itself. The burial pits, once sites of hurried disposal, became sources of renewed labor as prisoners dug up earlier victims under guard supervision. This macabre reversal of process required strict oversight to prevent resistance or collapse, and those assigned to this work were often executed once deemed too weakened or too knowledgeable. The cremation area expanded over time, with multiple pyres operating simultaneously during peak deportation periods, their smoke visible from a distance despite efforts to shield the site with trees and fencing. Administrators monitored output carefully, calculating the number of bodies burned per day to maintain parity with arrivals. Any backlog risked accumulation that could disrupt the system's cadence. The forested setting, initially chosen for isolation, became both asset and liability. It concealed operations from casual observation, yet intensified the smell and smoke trapped within its boundaries. As cremation intensified, the camp's geography subtly shifted. Burial pits were flattened, soil redistributed, and vegetation replanted in an attempt to restore a facade of normalcy. In later months, particularly as the front lines drew nearer in 1943, further efforts were made to dismantle structures and camouflage grounds, anticipating eventual inspection. Yet the scale of earlier operations made complete erasure impossible. Even as pyres consumed remains, fragments of bone persisted in the soil, and the sheer volume of ash exceeded what could be discreetly dispersed. The burial and cremation process reveals another layer of Treblinka's system. It was not enough to kill efficiently. The camp was engineered to manage the aftermath with equal precision. Every stage, from chamber to pit to pyre, was integrated into a cycle designed to minimize disruption and prevent accumulation of visible evidence. Guards enforced strict pace, ensuring that labor units maintained constant movement. Wood supplies were stockpiled in advance, and grates repaired regularly to sustain output. The soundscape of this area differed from the arrival square. Here, the crackle of fire and the grinding of bone fragments replaced the noise of engines and shouted orders. Administrative records rarely described these details explicitly, instead noting processing completed or grounds secured, language that concealed the labor of concealment itself. The burial pits and cremation grates thus became the final nodes in Treblinka's machinery, transforming bodies into ash and earth, integrating erasure into routine. By examining this process, we see how the camp structure adapted to challenges not of morality but of logistics, recalibrating methods to sustain secrecy and throughput simultaneously. The forest floor, once scarred by trenches, gradually bore the signs of deliberate landscaping, an attempt to rewrite the physical memory of what had transpired there. And yet, beneath the surface, traces remained, embedded in soil and scattered ash, silent witnesses to a system that sought not only to extinguish lives but to eliminate proof that those lives had ever passed through its gates. Chapter 4, Segment 3, Administrative Control, Record-Keeping, and the Illusion of Order. While the gas chambers, burial pits, and cremation grates carried out the visible mechanics of extermination, the sustained operation of Treblinka II depended equally on a quieter infrastructure. The administrative system that regulated schedules, personnel assignments, material supplies, and the steady flow of deportation transports. And it was within this bureaucratic framework that mass murder was transformed into routine procedure. Unlike larger concentration camp complexes with expansive documentation systems, Treblinka was deliberately structured to minimize written records, reducing the risk of incriminating archives. Nevertheless, Coordination required constant communication between railway authorities, regional occupation offices, and camp leadership. Deportation lists were compiled in ghettos and transit points, trains scheduled through the Reichsbahn network, and arrival times communicated in advance so that staff at Treblinka could prepare reception zones, labor detachments, and chamber cycles accordingly. The administrative head of the camp maintained oversight of personnel rosters, guard rotations, and liaison with higher SS authorities responsible for Operation Reinhard, ensuring that targets for deportation were met and that operational tempo remained aligned with broader policy objectives. Orders rarely described killing explicitly. Instead, euphemisms such as special treatment or resettlement appeared in communications, reflecting a deliberate linguistic strategy that shielded participants from confronting the full moral weight of their tasks. This coded language permeated internal reports, where efficiency metrics replaced human realities and transport tallies substituted for names. The camp's internal structure mirrored military hierarchy, with clear chains of command linking guards, supervisors, and administrative officers. Daily briefings established quotas and addressed logistical concerns, from fuel availability for engines and piers to maintenance of fencing and watchtowers. Even deception required coordination. Signage had to be maintained, clothing storage organized, and labor units assigned to sort belongings swiftly so that the appearance of orderly transit could be preserved for each incoming train. The sorting barracks functioned as an economic extension of the camp system, cataloging clothing, currency, and valuables for redistribution through centralized channels. Meticulous separation of goods, textiles, jewelry, documents ensured that nothing of material value was lost, reinforcing the integration of extermination into the Reich's economic apparatus. Administrative oversight also extended to discipline among staff, as unauthorized brutality that disrupted workflow or threatened secrecy could draw reprimand, not for humanitarian reasons but for operational stability. Guards were instructed to maintain strict control over prisoner labor units while avoiding unnecessary delays. Violence, though pervasive, was calibrated within the boundaries of maintaining productivity. The illusion of order was crucial. Transports had to be processed without visible backlog, grounds kept clear of visible congestion, and cremation output matched to arrival rates. To sustain this rhythm, camp leadership monitored daily figures, numbers of arrivals, numbers assigned to labor details, estimated chamber cycles completed, creating a statistical abstraction that replaced individual identities with operational metrics. In this system, human beings became entries in a logistical equation, and success was defined by the seamless continuation of process. External inspections were rare but anticipated, and preparations included cleaning reception areas and ensuring that guard conduct reflected procedural discipline. As rumors of Allied advances circulated in 1943, directives increasingly emphasized reduction of traceable documentation. Reports were summarized, correspondence minimized, and verbal instructions favored over written ones. This administrative caution foreshadowed later efforts to dismantle the camp and obscure its footprint. Yet even in its effort to erase itself, the system required careful planning. Materials for dismantling had to be sourced, transport lines redirected, and personnel reassigned. Administrative records that did survive, fragments recovered after the war, reveal a pattern of compartmentalization, where responsibilities were distributed so that no single individual handled every aspect of the operation, reinforcing both efficiency and plausible deniability. The camp thus operated as a node within a wider bureaucratic network, linked to ministries, railway authorities, and regional SS offices, each contributing to the continuity of the process. It is within this administrative dimension that Treblinka's terrifying efficiency becomes most apparent. The camp did not rely solely on physical force but on coordination, scheduling, and documentation practices that normalized extraordinary violence into routine tasks. Clerks tallied figures, supervisors verified counts, communications relayed arrival estimates, And at each step, the language of management concealed the reality of annihilation. By embedding extermination within familiar structures of oversight and reporting, Treblinka transformed radical destruction into administrative normalcy. This illusion of order extended to the camp's final phase, when leadership began implementing plans to dismantle buildings and plant trees over leveled ground. Instructions were issued, labor units reassigned, and structures methodically deconstructed, all under the same hierarchical discipline that had governed daily killing. The bureaucratic frame never disappeared. It merely shifted focus from throughput to concealment. Through this lens, Treblinka emerges not only as a site of physical extermination but as a case study in how administrative systems can be mobilized to sustain and mask atrocity. The camp's paperwork may have been sparse, its records intentionally limited, yet its operational coherence depended on constant coordination and record-keeping sufficient to keep the machinery running without interruption. In the quiet offices where figures were compiled and schedules confirmed, the violence of the gas chambers was translated into abstractions. Arrivals processed, tasks completed, objectives met. And in that translation, the horror was both enabled and obscured, hidden behind the facade of orderly administration that allowed one of the most lethal camps of Operation Reinhard to function with relentless, methodical precision. Chapter 5, Segment 1, Labor Units Within the Killing Center. Treblinka II was designed for extermination, not imprisonment, and yet within its fences there existed a population that did not die immediately upon arrival, a rotating system of forced labor units compelled to sustain the machinery of death. And it is within this internal workforce that the paradox of the camp becomes most visible, because even in a place built solely for annihilation, the system required hands to keep it functioning. These prisoners, often referred to as work details or Sonderkommandos in broader camp terminology, were selected from arriving transports moments after disembarkation, pulled aside under the pretense of temporary assignment, and forced into roles that bound them directly to the infrastructure of extermination. Their survival was never secure. It was conditional, temporary, and always shadowed by the knowledge that they, too, would eventually be replaced. Upon selection, these men were separated from the main flow of arrivals and marched into restricted zones where they were assigned specific tasks. Sorting clothing and belongings stripped from deportees, clearing the reception area after each transport, cleaning the undressing barracks, maintaining pathways, or assisting in the removal of bodies from the gas chambers. The sorting units worked in long wooden barracks where piles of garments rose into mounds, each item a trace of a life abruptly ended. Shoes were separated from coats, valuables hidden in linings were extracted, documents gathered and burned, and the contents packed for shipment back into the Reich. Efficiency was mandatory, because trains arrived in rapid succession and the illusion of order had to be maintained. Other units were assigned to the so-called tube, the fenced corridor that connected the undressing zone to the gas chambers. Here, prisoners were forced to clear debris, repair fencing, and remove signs of panic before the next transport arrived. The most harrowing detail belonged to those ordered to enter the gas chambers after each cycle, untangle bodies, and transport them to burial pits or later to cremation sites. They worked under constant surveillance, knowing that hesitation or visible distress could result in immediate execution. At first, bodies were carried to mass graves dug in sandy soil beyond the chambers, layered in long trenches. Later, when decomposition and evidence posed logistical and concealment challenges, these same labor units were compelled to exhume remains and construct open-air cremation grids, burning bodies in vast pyres that illuminated the forest night. The physical toll was immense. Starvation rations, beatings, exposure to disease, and psychological trauma combined to erode strength rapidly, and replacements were drawn from subsequent transports whenever a laborer became too weak to continue. Living quarters for these workers were separate from the killing zones but hardly humane. Overcrowded barracks, inadequate sanitation, and constant fear defined their existence. Guards enforced discipline through arbitrary violence, reinforcing the hierarchy that separated perpetrators from prisoners while simultaneously exploiting prisoner labor to sustain operations. Some work units were tasked with maintenance duties, repairing fences, digging new pits, transporting fuel, or assisting in the dismantling of structures, illustrating how the camp functioned as a self-contained system in which even the concealment of murder required coerced participation from victims. Communication among prisoners was dangerous but not impossible. Whispered exchanges carried fragments of information about the scale of killing and the fate of those who arrived, and over time, awareness deepened into understanding that no long-term survival existed within the camp's logic. Yet even within this engineered despair, small acts of solidarity emerged. Sharing scraps of food, warning newcomers selected for labor about the realities beyond the barracks, or quietly sabotaging tools when opportunities arose. The administration relied on calculated rotation. Entire labor detachments could be executed and replaced to prevent organization or resistance, reinforcing the atmosphere of instability that kept prisoners isolated and fearful. Despite this, the very structure of forced labor, the necessity of assigning prisoners to sustained roles, created limited spaces for coordination that would later influence acts of defiance. From a structural standpoint, these units reveal the contradiction at the heart of Treblinka II. Although conceived as a pure extermination center, it required a functioning internal workforce to manage the throughput of transports, the disposal of bodies, and the redistribution of seized property. Without these coerced laborers, the camp's pace would have faltered. With them, extermination could proceed with terrifying regularity. The labor system thus became an extension of the killing apparatus, blurring the boundary between victim and functionary while never diminishing the prisoner's status as targets of eventual elimination. Guards monitored output, counted work details at roll calls, and maintained strict separation between zones to prevent coordination beyond assigned tasks. Even within this rigid framework, the psychological burden was immense. Survivors would later recall the disorientation of performing tasks under duress, while witnessing the constant arrival of transports and the disappearance of entire communities within hours. Over time, some laborers developed intricate knowledge of the camp's layout, the position of guard posts, the rhythm of chamber cycles, the storage depots, and the routes through wooded perimeters, knowledge that would later shape moments of resistance. Yet, during the daily routine of operation, their existence was defined by survival measured in days, sometimes weeks, never certainty. In this segment of Treblinka's structure, we see how extermination depended not only on gas chambers and deception but on a coerced internal labor force compelled to sustain the system from within, transforming the camp into a grim machine powered by the very people it intended to destroy. Chapter 5, Segment 2, Administration, Command, and the Structure of Control. Behind the fences and watchtowers of Treblinka II stood a relatively small but tightly organized command structure that transformed ideological intent into operational reality. And understanding this administrative framework is essential to understanding how mass murder could function with such calculated regularity. Because the camp was not chaos, nor was it spontaneous cruelty. It was a bureaucratic system with ranks, schedules, documentation, and chains of command that ensured extermination proceeded as policy rather than impulse. At the top of this hierarchy stood the camp commandant, appointed within the broader structure of Operation Reinhard, responsible for maintaining efficiency, discipline, and secrecy. Beneath him were SS officers assigned specific supervisory roles over transport reception, gas chamber operations, labor details, and property management. Though the number of German personnel at Treblinka II remained relatively small, often fewer than 100, their authority was amplified by a structure that relied heavily on trained auxiliaries, including guards recruited from occupied territories, who performed perimeter security, escorted prisoners, and enforced order through intimidation and violence. Orders flowed downward in a clear hierarchy, and responsibilities were compartmentalized to preserve both efficiency and secrecy. Those overseeing the reception platform ensured transports were processed quickly. Those supervising the undressing barracks maintained the illusion of resettlement, and those assigned to the extermination zone oversaw the mechanics of killing itself. Administrative discipline was strict. Punctuality of trains was coordinated with railway authorities. Transport lists were checked against quotas, and valuables extracted from victims were catalogued and shipped back into the Reich through established channels. In this way, Treblinka II was not an isolated outpost but a node within a larger network. Its operations synchronized with deportation offices, railway timetables, and central authorities responsible for redistribution of confiscated goods. Communication between Treblinka and higher authorities occurred through official correspondence, reports, and logistical coordination, demonstrating that the camp functioned as part of a centralized policy rather than a rogue installation. The SS personnel assigned to Treblinka often had prior experience in the T4 euthanasia program, bringing with them expertise in organized killing procedures and in maintaining a facade of administrative normalcy while conducting lethal operations. Their training emphasized efficiency, secrecy, and emotional detachment, reinforcing the notion that extermination was a task to be completed rather than an act to be questioned. Discipline within the camp applied not only to prisoners but to guards and officers as well. Insubordination or failure to meet operational expectations could result in reassignment or punishment, reinforcing the culture of compliance that underpinned the entire system. Auxiliary guards, often drawn from Soviet prisoners of war or local collaborators, operated under SS supervision, receiving orders but rarely shaping policy. Yet their participation was essential in maintaining the daily rhythm of transports and containment. The administrative apparatus also extended to property management, where warehouses held clothing, luggage, and personal effects sorted by prisoner labor units. These goods were inventoried, bundled, and shipped, turning the aftermath of extermination into economic gain. Bureaucratic language masked reality. Reports spoke of transfers, resettlement, and processing, terms that concealed the violence taking place within the camp's restricted zones. Even the physical layout of Treblinka II reflected administrative logic. Separate zones for arrival, labor, extermination, and storage reduced congestion and allowed supervision to be concentrated at key choke points, while guard towers and fencing enforced clear boundaries between functions. Documentation was selective and often deliberately sparse, a strategy designed to minimize paper trails while still preserving operational coordination. This tension between record-keeping and concealment reveals the dual priorities of efficiency and secrecy that define the camp's management. Within the command structure, power was centralized yet dependent on cooperation. Officers relied on each other to maintain tempo, and shifts in leadership could influence the atmosphere of brutality or discipline within the camp, though the overarching goal of extermination remained constant. Over time, as deportations increased and the scale of killing expanded, administrative adjustments were made. Additional labor detachments assigned, burial methods altered, cremation facilities constructed, illustrating that the camp evolved in response to logistical demands rather than moral reflection. This adaptability underscores a chilling reality. Treblinka II was engineered not as a static installation, but as a responsive system capable of scaling operations according to quotas and directives. The small size of the German staff relative to the immense number of victims demonstrates how centralized authority, combined with coercion and hierarchical enforcement, enabled a limited cadre of officers to direct mass murder on an unprecedented scale. Control within the camp extended beyond physical force. It relied on discipline, compartmentalization, and a culture in which orders were executed without visible dissent, reinforcing the broader structure of Nazi governance. From the arrival platform to the gas chambers, every stage of the process was embedded within an administrative chain that minimized friction and maximized throughput, ensuring that transports moved with minimal delay and that evidence was systematically managed. In examining the structure of control, we see that Treblinka II functioned not through uncontrolled brutality alone, but through organized authority, a command system that translated ideology into daily procedure, transforming extermination into an administrative task carried out by officers who viewed their roles as assignments within a larger institutional framework. Chapter 5, Segment 3: Secrecy, Camouflage, and the System of Concealment. From the beginning, Treblinka II was not only designed to kill, it was designed to disappear, and the system of concealment built into its operation was as deliberate as the machinery of extermination itself, because secrecy was not an afterthought but a structural requirement, enforced through physical isolation, controlled information, and the systematic elimination of witnesses. The camp was constructed in a remote, wooded area near a minor railway junction, shielded from major population centers and surrounded by fencing layered with barbed wire interwoven with branches to obstruct sightlines, ensuring that even those who passed nearby could see little of what occurred inside. Guard towers monitored both prisoners and the perimeter, while strict access controls limited entry to authorized personnel only, creating a closed environment where knowledge was compartmentalized and tightly guarded. Camouflage extended beyond the outer fences. Buildings in the reception area were designed to resemble transit facilities, complete with signage that suggested showers and disinfection, reinforcing the illusion that deportees were merely being processed for relocation, while the extermination zone itself was concealed behind earthen berms and screens of trees, physically separating the killing area from the arrival platform to prevent newly arrived prisoners from witnessing what awaited them. Administrative language further obscured reality, replacing words like execution or killing with terms such as special treatment or evacuation, a vocabulary that insulated perpetrators psychologically while masking the true purpose of transports in official communications. Prisoners forced into labor within the camp were isolated by function. Those assigned to sorting clothing rarely interacted with those in the extermination zone, and those who handled bodies were themselves segregated, reducing the risk that any single individual possessed a complete picture of the process, while periodic executions of laborers ensured that knowledge did not accumulate beyond the control of the SS. As mass graves filled and the smell of decomposition threatened to expose the scale of killing, new methods were implemented to eliminate evidence. Bodies were exhumed and cremated on open-air pyres constructed from railway tracks. Ash was pulverized and scattered, and the ground was leveled to erase traces of burial sites, reflecting a calculated attempt to remove physical proof of what had occurred. Secrecy was also enforced through terror. Prisoners who spoke of escape or resistance faced immediate punishment, and auxiliary guards were warned of severe consequences should they disclose information, binding participants into a culture of silence sustained by fear as much as ideology. The broader Operation Reinhard network reinforced this concealment by limiting documentation, avoiding detailed records of extermination totals, and ensuring that command structures reported through controlled channels, thereby minimizing the paper trail that might later serve as evidence. Even transports were managed discreetly. Trains arrived under guarded conditions, often scheduled to avoid peak civilian observation, and deportees were instructed to remain calm under the pretense of resettlement, reducing the likelihood of panic that could attract attention from outside. When rumors of atrocities began to circulate in nearby communities, they were dismissed as exaggerations or suppressed through intimidation, illustrating how secrecy extended beyond the camp's fences into the surrounding environment. As the war shifted and German forces anticipated the possibility of defeat, the imperative to conceal intensified. Structures were dismantled, files destroyed, and attempts made to transform the site into farmland, complete with planted trees and a caretaker installed to maintain the appearance of normalcy, an act of erasure designed to overwrite memory with landscape. Yet concealment was never absolute. Fragments of testimony escaped, reports filtered through resistance networks, and survivors carried knowledge beyond the perimeter, revealing that even the most carefully constructed systems of silence could not fully contain truth. The paradox of Treblinka II lies in this dual architecture. It was engineered to operate at industrial scale while remaining officially invisible, a facility where extermination was both routine and denied, where the physical layout and administrative vocabulary worked together to create distance between action and acknowledgement. Secrecy was not merely protective. It was integral to the camp's function, enabling perpetrators to continue operations without public scrutiny and allowing higher authorities to maintain plausible deniability in the face of emerging evidence. In analyzing this system of camouflage and concealment, we see how the infrastructure of genocide extended beyond killing mechanisms into the realm of perception, manipulating what could be seen, recorded, or remembered, and demonstrating that Treblinka II was not only a site of destruction but a calculated exercise in disappearance, an attempt to commit mass murder while simultaneously erasing its own footprints, a strategy that ultimately failed, but whose sophistication underscores the extent to which concealment was embedded within the architecture of terror. Chapter 6, Segment 1, The Prisoner Labor System, Forced Complicity Inside Treblinka II. Treblinka II was built to ensure that almost no one survived, yet the camp could not function without prisoners forced to keep it running, and so at the center of this extermination facility existed a grim paradox. A small, rotating population of Jewish prisoners compelled to assist in the very system designed to murder their people. A labor structure rooted in coercion, terror, and calculated expendability. From each transport that arrived, a limited number of physically able men, and occasionally women, were selected at gunpoint and pulled aside before the majority were driven toward the gas chambers. These selected prisoners were not spared out of mercy but conscripted into a machinery that required hands to unload trains, sort belongings, clean barracks, cut hair, extract gold teeth, bury bodies, and later exhume and burn the dead, ensuring the process of extermination could operate with relentless efficiency. The labor system was divided into distinct work details, each isolated from the others to prevent communication and limit knowledge of the entire process. Some were assigned to the reception area, forced to reassure new arrivals under threat of death, while others were taken deeper into the camp's restricted extermination zone, where they became members of the Sonderkommando, prisoners compelled to remove bodies from gas chambers and prepare them for burial or cremation. These work units operated under constant surveillance by SS officers and Ukrainian auxiliaries, and discipline was maintained through random executions, public beatings, and the immediate killing of anyone who faltered, a regime of terror that ensured obedience not through loyalty but through the certainty that disobedience meant instant death. Prisoners lived in segregated barracks within the camp, separate from incoming transports and sealed off from the outside world. They were fed slightly more than those destined for immediate extermination, not as a gesture of humanity but as maintenance of labor capacity, because a starving worker could not lift bodies or haul heavy loads efficiently, and in Treblinka, productivity remained paramount even within genocide. The rotation of these laborers was deliberate. After weeks or months, when they had grown weak, traumatized, or simply knew too much, many were executed and replaced by new arrivals, a cycle designed to eliminate witnesses while sustaining operational continuity. And in this pattern of forced complicity we see how the camp functioned as both a killing center and a temporary labor prison, though survival within it was always precarious and conditional. Psychological coercion played as large a role as physical violence. Prisoners were made to shave the hair of women who believed they were preparing for showers, to sort through clothing that still held warmth from bodies moments earlier, to search for valuables hidden in hems or shoes, and to carry corpses that might include family members, neighbors, or strangers whose last expressions reflected betrayal by the illusion of safety. And this proximity to death created an environment where trauma was not incidental but structural, embedded into daily routine. Some prisoners were assigned to workshops, cobblers repairing boots for guards, tailors altering uniforms, carpenters constructing fencing or cremation platforms, illustrating that even within a death camp, infrastructure required upkeep, and that every nail driven or board cut indirectly sustained the larger objective of extermination. Communication between work groups was restricted, yet small networks of solidarity emerged. Prisoners shared fragments of information, passed scraps of food, or offered whispered warnings to new arrivals when possible, acts of quiet resistance that carried enormous risk, because any hint of coordinated dissent could trigger collective punishment. The labor system also reinforced deception. Selected prisoners in the arrival area were ordered to repeat scripted assurances that deportees would be disinfected and resettled, a cruel manipulation that exploited trust to prevent panic, and those who failed to maintain this facade were shot as examples to others. Over time, the prisoners working within the extermination zone came to understand the full scale of the camp's purpose, and this awareness fostered both despair and determination, for they recognized that their own survival depended on the continued arrival of transports, and that once deportation ceased, their usefulness would end and their lives would likely follow. This knowledge shaped a fragile equilibrium in which compliance was a survival strategy and yet moral anguish persisted, because every task completed prolonged both their own existence and the camp's operation. The SS exploited this dynamic ruthlessly, encouraging rivalries between work details, rotating assignments unpredictably, and ensuring that no stable leadership could form among prisoners. Yet despite these controls, the labor system inadvertently created conditions for observation and memory. Those forced to work witnessed procedures, identified routines, noted weaknesses in guard patterns, and absorbed the physical geography of the camp in ways that new arrivals could not. In examining Treblinka II's prisoner labor system, we confront one of the most disturbing dimensions of industrialized murder: the deliberate transformation of victims into coerced participants, not by choice but by terror, hunger, and the instinct to survive another hour, another day within a place designed to erase them. The system's cruelty lay not only in death but in the burden it imposed on the living, compelling human beings to sustain the apparatus that annihilated their communities, while knowing that they themselves remained disposable components in a process engineered for total extermination. And through this lens we see that Treblinka's efficiency was not solely mechanical but social, constructed through layers of fear, fragmentation, and enforced silence that bound prisoners into roles they never chose, roles that would later shape both testimony and remembrance when a small number managed, against overwhelming odds, to outlive the camp's attempt to erase every trace of its existence. Chapter 6, Segment 2: The Economy of Plunder, Sorting, Extraction, and the Business of Murder. Treblinka II was not only a killing center, it was also a meticulously organized system of theft, and within its fences the murder of human beings was inseparable from the systematic seizure of everything they owned, transforming genocide into a coordinated economic enterprise that fed directly into the machinery of the Reich. Every transport that arrived carried more than people. It carried suitcases, clothing, jewelry, currency, watches, eyeglasses, tools, photographs, children's toys, and hidden valuables sewn into linings or concealed in shoes. And from the moment deportees were forced onto the platform, the process of dispossession began with ruthless precision. Prisoners assigned to the sorting details were compelled to empty luggage into designated piles, separate garments by category, inspect seams for concealed gold, and extract valuables under the watchful eyes of guards who understood that each ring or coin represented revenue for the state. Hair cut from women before they were driven toward the gas chambers was collected, dried, and packaged, later to be used for industrial purposes. Gold teeth were pulled from corpses by prisoner dentists under orders, melted down, and added to Reich reserves. Foreign currency was counted and shipped to central offices. Even clothing was disinfected and redistributed to German civilians or soldiers, illustrating how the camp's operations were integrated into a broader economic structure that extended far beyond its barbed wire perimeter. The efficiency of this plunder required order, and so administrative routines governed the chaos. Inventories were recorded, shipments labeled, warehouses cataloged, and transportation schedules coordinated, all of it documented through bureaucratic channels that rendered theft and murder into lines of accounting. In this environment, the victims were reduced not only to numbers but to sources of material yield, their lives quantified in terms of recoverable assets, and the SS officers overseeing Treblinka understood that maximizing confiscated goods was as much a priority as maintaining the pace of extermination. Prisoners working in the sorting barracks described rooms stacked high with shoes arranged in pairs, mountains of clothing rising like unnatural hills, crates filled with spectacles that once framed the faces of men, women, and children who no longer existed, and the repetitive task of sorting through these objects created a second layer of horror, because each item was a reminder of individuality extinguished. The guards enforced strict discipline to prevent theft by prisoners, yet some risked hiding a coin or a scrap of food to barter later, acts that could result in execution if discovered, reinforcing the reality that even within a system built on mass robbery, possession remained tightly controlled by those in power. The plunder economy also required coordination with railway authorities, postal services, and financial institutions, as shipments of confiscated goods were transported back into Germany and absorbed into civilian life, blurring the line between frontline atrocity and homefront complicity. Coats worn in Berlin winters, furniture used in offices, and currency circulating in banks might trace their origin to the belongings of those murdered at Treblinka, illustrating how genocide permeated the ordinary structures of society. Within the camp, the sorting area operated continuously, because transports arrived frequently during peak periods of Operation Reinhard, and delays in processing belongings could disrupt the entire schedule. So prisoners labored long hours under constant threat, knowing that inefficiency could be punished with death. Over time, the warehouses became so full that shipments had to be accelerated, and the scale of accumulated goods testified to the enormity of the crime even as the SS attempted to conceal its human dimension. Material abundance stood in grotesque contrast to the starvation and deprivation inflicted upon prisoners forced to handle these riches. The administrative structure overseeing plunder was connected to higher authorities, ensuring that revenue flowed upward, and this chain of command embedded Treblinka within a national system of exploitation, where killing and looting were mutually reinforcing components of policy rather than spontaneous acts of brutality. For the prisoners compelled to participate, the sorting barracks became spaces of whispered recognition. They might find a photograph bearing a familiar face, a prayer book from a known synagogue, a child's coat from their own neighborhood, and in those moments the abstraction of deportation collapsed into personal loss, yet they could not pause or grieve openly, because the rhythm of work allowed no interruption. This economy of plunder reveals another dimension of Treblinka's structure. Extermination was accompanied by extraction, and the camp functioned as both a site of mass murder and a clearinghouse for stolen wealth, where efficiency was measured not only in the number of victims processed but in the value of goods recovered. When later attempts were made to erase the camp, warehouses were dismantled and records destroyed, yet the traces of this economic enterprise survived in testimony and surviving documents, demonstrating that Treblinka's operation depended on a fusion of ideology and opportunism, hatred and greed, and that the machinery of death was sustained by meticulous attention to property as much as to procedure. In understanding this plunder system, we see how genocide was embedded in everyday structures, how railways transported not just bodies but belongings, how clerks tallied confiscated assets, how civilians received redistributed goods, and how Treblinka's role within this network extended beyond its fences, linking the camp to the broader economic life of the Reich in ways that challenged the notion of isolated atrocity. The business of murder at Treblinka was therefore both physical and financial, and within its sorting barracks the final remnants of individuality were stripped away, categorized, and absorbed into a state apparatus that converted human lives into inventory, profit, and logistical output, leaving behind only absence where people had once stood. Chapter 6, Segment 3, Erasing the Crime, the Machinery of Concealment. By late 1942 and into 1943, as rumors spread and the tide of war began to shift, the men who operated Treblinka II understood that the same efficiency they had applied to killing would now be required to erase the evidence of what they had done, and so the camp entered a new phase, not of mercy, but of concealment, transforming once again from a site of active extermination into a landscape of calculated destruction. The orders were clear. The graves that held hundreds of thousands of bodies could not remain as silent witnesses, and the vast pits filled during the height of deportations became liabilities to a regime already anticipating defeat. Decomposition had begun to distort the earth, and the odor carried beyond the fences, So the SS initiated a systematic program to exhume the corpses and burn them on open-air pyres constructed from railway tracks and concrete blocks, a gruesome industrial solution, intended to reduce the dead to ash. Prisoners forced into this new labor detail worked under suffocating smoke and constant surveillance, dragging decomposed remains from the ground, stacking them in layers with wood and fuel, and igniting fires that burned day and night, turning the soil of Treblinka into a furnace and the sky into a veil of smoke that could be seen from miles away. The process was methodical, organized into teams with assigned tasks, because even the destruction of evidence followed administrative order. Ashes were crushed, sifted for unburned fragments or gold teeth, and then scattered or reburied to minimize visible traces, and in this grim inversion of burial rites, the dead were subjected to a second violation meant to eliminate proof of their existence. As graves were emptied and burned, structures within the camp were dismantled or redesigned to remove incriminating features, and records, already minimal by design, were destroyed, reducing the paper trail to fragments. Yet the scale of the operation could not be entirely hidden from those who labored within it, and among prisoners there was a growing awareness that the camp itself might soon disappear. In the summer of 1943, after the revolt at Sobibor and amid fears of similar uprisings, Treblinka's administrators accelerated plans to dismantle the killing center, and transports diminished until operations ceased altogether. Gas chambers were torn down, barracks dismantled, fences removed, and the land reshaped to appear as ordinary farmland, with a farmhouse constructed and a small Ukrainian guard detachment left behind to create the illusion of normalcy. This final transformation was perhaps the most chilling demonstration of bureaucratic logic. Once the camp had fulfilled its purpose, it was to be erased not only physically but from memory, converted into a blank space where the machinery of death had once operated with terrifying regularity. Prisoners who had survived long enough to witness this phase were either transferred to other camps or murdered, reducing the number of potential witnesses, and yet despite these efforts, fragments of testimony endured, carried by those who escaped or survived transfer, ensuring that Treblinka would not vanish entirely into silence. The erasure extended beyond physical destruction to linguistic concealment, with euphemisms maintained even in final reports, and with officials speaking of resettlement actions completed rather than extermination achieved, preserving the bureaucratic fiction that had shielded perpetrators from confronting the reality of their crimes. The landscape itself was altered. Mass graves leveled, ash mixed into soil, trees planted to obscure the disturbed ground, and paths rerouted to eliminate the geometry of murder that had once defined the camp's layout. But beneath this surface the earth retained its memory, and the land remained saturated with what had occurred. When the Red Army advanced into the region in 1944, they found little of the original infrastructure, yet survivors and local witnesses provided accounts that allowed investigators to piece together the story, demonstrating that concealment, no matter how thorough, could not fully extinguish truth. The attempt to destroy evidence reveals a final structural element of Treblinka's design. The system anticipated not only killing but denial, embedding within its operation a plan for disappearance that mirrored the erasure of its victims from official records. In this phase, the camp became a workshop of obliteration, where labor once directed at sorting belongings or managing arrivals was redirected toward dismantling walls and burning remains, and where the rhythm of extermination gave way to the rhythm of concealment, each act performed with the same cold precision that had characterized earlier operations. The SS officers overseeing this transition believed that by flattening the ground and dispersing the ashes they could sever the link between crime and place, transforming Treblinka into a site without history. But they underestimated the resilience of testimony and the persistence of memory, and in that miscalculation lies a paradox. The very effort to erase the camp underscores the magnitude of what had occurred there. In understanding this final stage, we see how the architecture of Treblinka extended beyond gas chambers and fences to include a blueprint for disappearance, a layered system in which extermination was followed by excavation, burning, dismantling, and disguise, all governed by the same administrative discipline that had enabled mass murder in the first place. The machinery of concealment, like the machinery of death, relied on coordination, secrecy, and obedience, revealing that genocide in this context was not a single act but a sequence of processes designed to eliminate both people and proof. And yet, despite the smoke, the leveling, and the planted fields, Treblinka did not vanish. Its absence became evidence, its silence became testimony, and the attempt to erase it became part of its enduring history, ensuring that the camp built for efficiency and secrecy would remain a symbol of both the system that created it and the failure of that system to bury its own crimes. Chapter 7, Segment 1. The Revolt: Planning Resistance Inside a Death Camp. By the summer of 1943, Treblinka II was no longer operating at the relentless pace of its peak months. Yet for the prisoners forced to live and work within its fences, survival still meant existing inside a system designed to erase them at any moment. And it was within this narrowing space between labor and liquidation that the idea of revolt began to take form, not as an act of sudden rage but as a calculated response to the growing realization that the camp itself might soon be dismantled, and its remaining prisoners killed to eliminate witnesses. The men assigned to the Sonderkommando labor detachments, tailors, carpenters, mechanics, cleaners, and those forced to manage the warehouses of stolen belongings, moved daily through carefully controlled zones, observing guard routines, counting weapons, memorizing gate positions, and noting which SS officers carried keys. They understood the geography of Treblinka intimately because their lives depended on navigating it without error, and this familiarity became the foundation of resistance. Unlike camps built for long-term imprisonment, Treblinka offered little time for planning, as new arrivals were murdered within hours and labor prisoners were frequently replaced. Yet a small core of individuals managed to survive long enough to build trust and coordinate ideas, recognizing that waiting for liberation was unrealistic in a place designed to leave no survivors. The revolt's architects faced extraordinary constraints. Constant surveillance by German SS men and Ukrainian guards, restricted movement between camp sections, and the absence of outside communication, and yet within these limits they began forming a clandestine network that spanned work details, using coded conversations and moments of relative privacy to exchange information. The plan that gradually emerged was rooted in practicality rather than heroics. They would seize weapons from the camp's armory, eliminate key guards, set fire to structures to create confusion, and attempt a mass breakout through the perimeter, understanding fully that success meant not victory over the regime but the chance that some might escape to tell the world what had occurred behind the fences. Every aspect of preparation required discipline and secrecy. Duplicate keys to the weapons store were crafted by prisoners assigned to workshops. Axes and knives were hidden in work areas. Signals were agreed upon. Roles were assigned so that when the moment came, chaos would serve as cover rather than paralysis. The timing of the revolt became critical, as transports had slowed and rumors circulated that the camp would soon be dismantled. If the prisoners waited too long, they risked being executed individually or transferred to other camps, but acting too soon risked detection before the network was ready. The tension between urgency and caution defined these weeks of preparation, as each day of delay meant another opportunity for betrayal or discovery, yet also allowed for refinement of the plan and quiet recruitment of additional participants. The psychological dimension of organizing resistance inside a death camp cannot be separated from its structural reality. These were men who had witnessed the systematic extermination of families and entire communities, who worked daily among the belongings of the murdered, and who understood that their own survival was temporary, and yet within this environment of calculated dehumanization, they reclaimed agency by choosing to act rather than await annihilation. Trust became the revolt's most fragile resource, because infiltration by informants or a careless word could doom the effort before it began, and so leaders limited knowledge of the full plan to a small circle while assigning tasks without revealing the broader objective, creating a layered structure of participation that mirrored, in inverse form, the administrative hierarchy of the camp itself. The choice of weapons reflected the camp's realities. Firearms would be essential but scarce, requiring access to the armory. Other tools, axes, hammers, knives, would serve in close quarters, and fire, perhaps the most unpredictable element, would be used to spread panic and disrupt communication between guard posts. Even the geography of Treblinka shaped the revolt's strategy, as the perimeter fence, reinforced with barbed wire and anti-tank obstacles, required careful selection of escape points, and nearby minefields posed lethal risks that escapees would have to navigate under gunfire. Despite these obstacles, planning continued because the alternative, passive submission to inevitable execution, offered no future at all, and in this calculation lay the revolt's moral clarity. The uprising was not an attempt to overthrow the system but to fracture it long enough for some to survive. In the days leading up to the chosen date in August 1943, participants rehearsed their roles in whispers and glances, storing tools where they could be retrieved quickly, and maintaining outward compliance to avoid suspicion, while beneath the surface the camp's imposed order masked a growing current of defiance. The revolt's significance lies not only in its outcome but in its preparation, because it demonstrates that even within a structure engineered for total control, cracks could form where human will persisted, and in those cracks, coordination, courage, and calculated risk coalesced into action. Treblinka II had been designed to function with terrifying efficiency, its processes reducing individuals to numbers and ash, yet the very routines that sustained this efficiency, predictable guard shifts, centralized storage of weapons, reliance on prisoner labor for daily operations, also created vulnerabilities that attentive prisoners could exploit, and thus the revolt emerged from the camp's own structure, an unintended consequence of a system that depended on those it sought to destroy. As the appointed day approached, the tension within the labor detachments was palpable yet concealed, each participant aware that discovery meant immediate execution, but also aware that inaction meant certain death, and so the plan advanced toward its moment of ignition, not as an act of desperation alone, but as a deliberate attempt to break the silence of a place built to leave none alive to speak. Chapter 7, Segment 2. The Day of Fire, August 2nd, 1943. On the afternoon of August 2nd, 1943, Treblinka II appeared, at least from the outside, to function as it always had, its guards moving along habitual paths, its watchtowers scanning the perimeter, its labor detachments carrying out assigned tasks beneath a sky that gave no indication that the camp's fragile order was about to fracture. And yet beneath that surface routine a sequence of carefully arranged actions was unfolding, each step dependent on timing, nerve, and the silent coordination of men who understood that within hours many of them would be dead. The revolt's planners had chosen a moment when several SS officers were absent from the camp, reducing the number of armed supervisors on site, and when the afternoon heat would slow guard vigilance, and as work details moved between zones under routine supervision, selected prisoners quietly broke from their assigned paths to retrieve concealed tools and approach the armory under the pretext of ordinary duties. A duplicate key, crafted weeks earlier, was used to open the weapons store, and small numbers of rifles and pistols were removed and distributed discreetly among designated participants, each man concealing his weapon beneath clothing or within bundles to avoid immediate detection, aware that the entire plan could collapse if a single guard noticed the irregular movement. Simultaneously, other prisoners set small fires in storage areas, igniting piles of clothing and fuel to create smoke and confusion, the flames serving both as a signal and as a means of disrupting communication between camp sections. And as smoke began to rise above the barracks, the illusion of routine dissolved into sudden alarm. The first shots were fired at close range, axes and knives used in confined spaces to eliminate guards before they could reach their weapons, and for a brief, disorienting interval the balance of control shifted, as prisoners surged toward predetermined exit points, shouting warnings, urging others to run, and attempting to overwhelm sections of the perimeter before reinforcements could mobilize. Chaos spread quickly. Flames leapt from structures, ammunition detonated unpredictably, and watchtowers erupted with gunfire as guards realized the scale of the uprising. Their initial confusion giving way to coordinated response, and the camp that had functioned with mechanical precision now became a battlefield of smoke, noise, and desperate motion. Prisoners raced toward the outer fence, some using planks and ladders prepared in advance, others climbing directly over barbed wire despite the risk of entanglement, while bullets cut through the air and bodies fell in the open ground between barracks and perimeter. The minefields beyond the fence posed an additional hazard, and several escapees were killed by explosions as they crossed terrain that had been designed to prevent precisely such flight. Yet amid the violence and loss, a significant number of prisoners breached the perimeter and reached the surrounding forest, scattering in multiple directions to reduce the likelihood of recapture. And in that scattering lay the revolt's strategic intent: survival through dispersal, testimony through escape. Inside the camp, fighting continued briefly as guards regained control, executing those who had not escaped and extinguishing fires to prevent further structural damage. And by evening, Treblinka's administrators were already assessing the aftermath, counting casualties among staff and prisoners, and organizing pursuit parties to track escapees through nearby villages and woods. The revolt did not dismantle the camp in a single day, but it irreparably damaged its operation. Within weeks, the SS began accelerating plans to liquidate Treblinka entirely, dismantling buildings, leveling structures, and attempting to erase evidence of the mass murder that had taken place, a process made more urgent by the knowledge that survivors were now beyond the fence carrying memory with them. The uprising's immediate cost was severe, with hundreds of prisoners killed during the escape or in the days of pursuit that followed, yet its significance cannot be measured solely in numbers. For a system built on the assumption that victims would remain silent and compliant until death, the spectacle of armed resistance within the camp's core represented a rupture in the narrative of total control. The revolt demonstrated that even within a structure engineered to eliminate witnesses, agency could reemerge in collective form, and although the camp's machinery continued briefly after August 2nd, it operated under the shadow of its own vulnerability, aware that the men forced to sustain its daily routines had proven capable of coordinated defiance. As night fell over the damaged compound, smoke lingering above blackened barracks and shattered fences, the surviving escapees moved through forests and fields, pursued by patrols and aided in some cases by local resistance networks, while behind them Treblinka entered its final phase, no longer merely a site of extermination but also the scene of an insurrection that would ensure its crimes could not be entirely concealed. The day of fire did not undo the thousands of transports that had arrived before it, nor did it save the majority of those still imprisoned, but it altered the historical trajectory of the camp by creating survivors who could testify to its structure, its deception, and its purpose, transforming Treblinka from a place intended to leave no trace into a documented crime scene in human memory. And in that transformation lay the revolt's enduring legacy, forged in hours of smoke, gunfire, and the calculated decision to run toward the possibility of death rather than wait for certainty. Chapter 7, Segment 3, Aftermath, Erasure, and the End of Treblinka II. In the days that followed the uprising of August 2, 1943, Treblinka II did not fall silent immediately, nor did it collapse in a single dramatic gesture. Instead, it entered a final phase marked by urgency, retaliation, and systematic erasure, as the SS command recognized that the camp's most guarded secret had been pierced and that the existence of living witnesses posed a threat greater than the damage inflicted by fire or gunfire. Surviving prisoners who had not escaped were rounded up, interrogated, and in many cases executed, their bodies disposed of with the same administrative detachment that had characterized the camp's operations from the beginning, while search units combed the surrounding forests and villages in pursuit of escapees, offering rewards for information and issuing warnings designed to discourage assistance from local populations. Many of those who fled were captured and killed within days, cut down in fields or betrayed under pressure, yet some managed to evade pursuit long enough to join partisan groups or find refuge, carrying with them the memory of Treblinka's layout, its procedures, and its purpose, fragments of knowledge that would later become testimony. Inside the perimeter, the SS accelerated a process that had already begun months earlier, the dismantling of the camp's physical infrastructure to conceal the scale of its crimes. Buildings were taken apart piece by piece, barracks and administrative offices disassembled, gas chamber structures destroyed, and the earth itself disturbed to remove traces of mass graves that had previously been exhumed and cremated under Operation 1005, the code name for the systematic destruction of evidence at extermination sites. Prisoners forced to participate in this final phase of concealment labored under the knowledge that their work was designed to erase not only physical structures but also the memory of those who had perished, and once their tasks were complete, they too were killed, reducing the number of direct witnesses to the smallest possible count. The camp's grounds were leveled, and in a final gesture of calculated deception, a farmhouse was constructed on the site, with a Ukrainian guard installed to present the appearance of ordinary agricultural use, an attempt to transform a landscape of mass murder into an unremarkable rural property. By late 1943, Treblinka II ceased to function as an extermination center, its transports halted, its staff reassigned to other duties within the collapsing Reich, and its machinery of death dismantled not out of remorse but out of strategic calculation, as the front lines shifted and the possibility of Soviet advance loomed closer. Yet even as the physical structures vanished, the administrative records of deportations and transports persisted in fragments across occupied Europe, railway documents, ghetto lists, and correspondence that, when pieced together after the war, revealed the scale of what had occurred between July 1942 and the revolt's aftermath. The uprising did not save the majority of those imprisoned at Treblinka, nor did it prevent the SS from attempting to bury the camp's existence beneath soil and silence, but it altered the narrative of total annihilation by ensuring that a number of survivors remained to recount the camp's structure and methods in detail. In the forests where some escapees found temporary refuge, survival was uncertain, dependent on food, secrecy, and the willingness of others to risk severe punishment for offering aid, and many of those who survived the initial escape still faced months of danger before the war's end. Meanwhile, within the broader context of Operation Reinhard, the dismantling of Treblinka signaled the near completion of the extermination campaign against the Jews of the general government. As Belzec had already been destroyed and Sobibor would soon follow a similar trajectory after its own revolt in October 1943. Treblinka's closure did not mark an end to killing within the Nazi system, but it represented the conclusion of a specific phase of industrialized mass murder that had operated with terrifying efficiency for little more than a year. When Soviet forces eventually reached the region in 1944, they encountered not an intact camp but a landscape deliberately reshaped to conceal its past. Yet investigations and survivor testimonies began to reconstruct what had been hidden, mapping foundations, tracing burial sites, and correlating deportation records with eyewitness accounts. The attempt to erase Treblinka ultimately failed in the realm that mattered most: memory, because the revolt ensured that the camp's internal mechanisms would not disappear entirely with its buildings. Post-war trials drew upon the accounts of survivors and documentary fragments to prosecute some of those responsible, though many perpetrators evaded justice or lived quietly for decades before being identified, and the process of reckoning unfolded unevenly across nations grappling with the enormity of the Holocaust. Treblinka II, conceived as a site designed to leave no trace of its victims, became instead a symbol of both systematic extermination and collective resistance. Its fields transformed into a memorial landscape where stones now mark communities destroyed, and the silence that once concealed atrocity now invites reflection. The final months of the camp's existence illustrate the paradox at the heart of the Nazi project. A regime obsessed with order and documentation resorted to frantic destruction of evidence when confronted with the possibility of accountability, revealing an implicit awareness of guilt even as it denied wrongdoing. The revolt, though costly and limited in immediate impact, disrupted the illusion of absolute control and ensured that Treblinka's story would survive beyond the fence line, carried by those who escaped and later testified before courts and historians. In that sense, the camp's end was not solely a matter of dismantled structures or reassigned personnel. It was the transformation of a site intended for total erasure into one documented through witness, archive, and memorial, a place where the machinery of death was exposed rather than forgotten. The SS sought to make Treblinka vanish, to fold it back into the forest as though it had never existed, but the uprising fractured that ambition, embedding the camp within historical record and collective consciousness. And as the war drew toward its own catastrophic conclusion, Treblinka's brief but devastating operation stood as evidence of how rapidly bureaucratic planning, logistical coordination, and ideological conviction could converge to produce annihilation on an unprecedented scale, and how, even within such a system, the decision to resist could reverberate far beyond the boundaries of barbed wire and ash. Chapter 8, Segment 1. Counting the dead scale, numbers, and the mechanics of annihilation. By the time Treblinka II ceased operation in late 1943, it had existed for barely 15 months. Yet within that short span it became one of the deadliest killing sites in human history, a place where time itself seemed compressed, where entire communities vanished in weeks, and where the scale of destruction can only be understood by examining the rhythm and structure of its daily function, rather than by imagining isolated moments of violence. Unlike sprawling camp systems that combined labor, imprisonment, and gradual death, Treblinka II operated with singular purpose: the rapid extermination of deported Jews from across occupied Poland and parts of Europe, primarily under the framework of Operation Reinhard. Transports arrived with relentless regularity, often several per day during peak months in 1942, each train carrying between 5,000 and 7,000 people in freight cars designed for animals, sealed with little ventilation, no sanitation, and minimal water, ensuring that some passengers perished even before reaching the camp. Upon arrival, the process unfolded with choreographed speed, deception masking intention, orders barked in rehearsed tones, and selections limited not to life or death, but to immediate death or temporary forced labor in the Sonderkommando units. Within hours of arrival, the majority of deportees were stripped of possessions, separated by gender, driven through the camouflaged path to the gas chambers, and murdered, their bodies later buried in mass graves and eventually exhumed and burned to eliminate evidence. When historians reconstruct the numbers, they do so through fragmentary transport records, survivor testimony, railway documentation, and post-war investigations, yet even conservative estimates indicate that between 700,000 and 900,000 Jews were murdered at Treblinka II, making it second only to Auschwitz-Birkenau in total victims, though Treblinka achieved its toll in a far shorter operational period. These figures are not abstract. They represent entire towns emptied, ghettos liquidated, family names erased from census rolls, synagogues silenced, schools abandoned, and marketplaces stilled, each transport corresponding to a location whose absence would later be measured in memorial plaques and survivor lists. The efficiency of the camp's design meant that the number of permanent staff required to maintain this killing rate was astonishingly small. Fewer than 100 German and Austrian SS personnel, supported by several hundred trained auxiliaries, primarily Soviet POWs recruited as guards, oversaw the extermination of hundreds of thousands, illustrating how concentrated administrative control could amplify destructive capacity when combined with ideological conviction and logistical coordination. The gas chambers themselves evolved over time, initially smaller and limited in capacity, later expanded into larger brick structures capable of killing thousands per day using engine exhaust, a technology crude yet effective, and the physical layout ensured that the flow of victims moved in one direction only, from train platform to undressing yard to gas chamber to burial site, eliminating the possibility of return. During peak operations in late summer and autumn 1942, daily death counts may have exceeded 10,000, a figure that challenges comprehension because it compresses catastrophe into a single sunrise and sunset. The camp's rhythm was dictated by railway timetables and administrative quotas, and the extermination process functioned with a grim predictability that rendered mass murder routine to its operators, who measured success in throughput and concealment rather than in conventional military objectives. Yet the attempt to quantify Treblinka also reveals the limits of numbers. Because documentation was deliberately destroyed, transports were not always consistently recorded, and entire communities were annihilated without surviving witnesses, leaving historians to triangulate evidence from disparate sources. Survivor testimony provides insight into the scale not only in numerical terms but in sensory detail. The constant arrival of trains, the smoke rising from burning pyres during the exhumation phase, the smell of decay that lingered across the campgrounds, and the unending cycle of stripping, killing, and disposal that defined each day. When the uprising disrupted operations in August 1943, the camp had already completed the bulk of its extermination mission under Operation Reinhard, suggesting that the SS considered the destruction of Polish Jewry in that region largely accomplished. The scale of Treblinka II thus cannot be understood solely by examining its structures or personnel. It must be contextualized within a broader administrative system that coordinated deportations from ghettos in Warsaw, Radom, Białystok, and beyond, aligning train schedules with gas chamber capacity, ensuring that no transport arrived without the machinery prepared to absorb and annihilate it. The camp's relative isolation in a forested area near the village of Treblinka masked its function from distant observers, yet the volume of trains and the smoke from cremation efforts were visible signs that something extraordinary was occurring, even if its full magnitude remained obscured by censorship and fear. After the war, attempts to establish precise victim counts became part of judicial and historical processes, and while exact figures may never be definitively fixed, the consensus affirms Treblinka II as a site where annihilation was conducted on an industrial scale, compressed into months, administered by a small cadre, and facilitated by modern transportation infrastructure. In evaluating the camp's scale, one confronts a disquieting truth. The machinery of death did not require vast armies or elaborate fortifications. It required organization, obedience, and the steady arrival of trains. Each transport represented a chapter abruptly closed, and the cumulative effect of those arrivals constituted a demographic catastrophe whose traces can be mapped in post-war population voids across Eastern Europe. The counting of the dead at Treblinka is therefore both a statistical exercise and an ethical imperative, an effort to restore dimension to lives reduced by perpetrators to anonymous cargo. As we move further into the structural analysis of Treblinka II, the scale established here frames every subsequent detail, reminding us that behind each administrative decision and architectural adjustment lay the fate of thousands, and that the camp's brief operational life encompassed destruction on a scale that permanently altered the human geography of an entire region. Chapter 8, Segment 2: Concealment, Erasure, and the Attempt to Bury the Truth. As the pace of extermination at Treblinka II reached its height and then began to stabilize in late 1942, a new phase emerged alongside the machinery of killing, the machinery of concealment, an effort not only to destroy lives but to erase the physical evidence that those lives had ever passed through the camp's gates. The leadership of Operation Reinhard understood that what was taking place at Treblinka was not a temporary wartime measure but a crime of such magnitude that, if discovered in full detail, it would stand as undeniable proof of systematic genocide. Thus, even while transports continued to arrive, orders were issued to exhume the mass graves that had filled the sandy soil surrounding the gas chambers. The early months of operation had relied on burial pits dug by forced labor units, trenches layered with bodies, covered in earth, and concealed within the forest perimeter. But decomposition, shifting ground, and the sheer volume of corpses began to threaten both sanitation and secrecy. The solution was grimly methodical. Under the direction of SS officers, Jewish prisoners were forced to reopen the graves, retrieve decomposing bodies, and burn them on massive pyres constructed from railway tracks laid over concrete supports, transforming burial sites into open-air cremation grounds. This operation, known as part of Action 1005, aimed to eliminate forensic traces of mass murder across occupied territories, and at Treblinka it meant months of relentless labor amid smoke, ash, and unbearable stench. The prisoners assigned to this work were aware that their own survival was temporary. They were witnesses compelled to destroy evidence of the very crime they were enduring. Fires burned day and night, visible from a distance, and the landscape of the camp shifted from one of hidden graves to one of constant incineration, the air thick with particles that settled over the surrounding trees and fields. Administrative records were minimal by design, and many were later destroyed outright, but the physical transformation of the site was unmistakable. burial pits emptied, ashes crushed and scattered, bone fragments ground to reduce identifiable remains, all in pursuit of an illusion that the camp could vanish as completely as its victims. By early 1943, with the majority of deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto and other regions completed, Treblinka's role within Operation Reinhard was nearing its intended conclusion. The SS leadership began planning the dismantling of the camp itself, recognizing that the extermination phase in that region had largely achieved its objective. Barracks were taken apart, gas chamber structures demolished, and materials salvaged or destroyed. The ground was plowed over, planted with lupin and other crops to simulate agricultural use, and a farmhouse was constructed on the property, staffed by a former guard posing as a local farmer. A final theatrical gesture designed to suggest normal rural life where mass murder had occurred. This staged pastoral scene was not an act of remorse but of calculated denial, an attempt to rewrite the landscape so thoroughly that future investigators would find nothing but fields and scattered debris. Yet the attempt at erasure was imperfect. Survivors of the camp's uprising had escaped into the surrounding forests and would later testify. Railway records could not be entirely obliterated. Nearby residents had witnessed trains arriving and smoke rising, and the sheer scale of deportations left demographic voids that could not be explained away by wartime chaos alone. When the Red Army advanced into the region in 1944, they encountered a site that appeared superficially dismantled, but excavations and testimonies soon revealed the depth of what had taken place. The effort to conceal Treblinka underscores a crucial dimension of its operation: the perpetrators' anticipated judgment. The destruction of evidence was not spontaneous panic but an organized extension of the camp's administrative logic. Just as arrivals were scheduled and processed with efficiency, so too was the dismantling of structures and obliteration of graves coordinated through written orders and hierarchical command. This phase reveals that genocide was accompanied not only by killing but by narrative control, an understanding that history itself could become a battlefield. The SS officers who oversaw Treblinka attempted to ensure that the story would end with silence, that the forest would absorb memory as it had absorbed ash. Yet memory proved more resilient than anticipated. Survivor accounts reconstructed the camp's layout in remarkable detail, describing the undressing yard, the fenced pathway to the gas chambers, the engine room, and the cremation sites. Post-war investigations pieced together fragments of documentation and cross-referenced them with testimonies from perpetrators and bystanders. The soil itself, disturbed and layered with ash, bore witness to the mass exhumations and burnings. Even the attempt to hide the crime became part of its historical record, illustrating the perpetrator's awareness of culpability. The concealment operations also carried a psychological dimension. Prisoners forced to exhume and burn bodies were subjected to an additional layer of dehumanization, compelled to participate in the destruction of their own community's remains. This cruel extension of labor served both practical and punitive purposes, reinforcing the camp's atmosphere of absolute domination. By the time Treblinka was officially dismantled in late 1943, it had completed its central role in Operation Reinhard, and its physical traces were reduced to a deceptive landscape of fields and sparse structures. Yet the attempt to bury the truth ultimately failed. In the years following the war, archaeological studies and memorial efforts transformed the site into a place of remembrance rather than denial. Thousands of symbolic stones now stand where trains once unloaded victims, each engraved with the name of a destroyed community. The transformation from concealed killing ground to memorial space underscores the limits of erasure. Treblinka's operators sought to eliminate both bodies and memory, but history persisted through testimony, documentation, and the enduring absence left behind. The concealment phase of Treblinka therefore completes the structural picture of the camp. It was not only engineered for efficient extermination but also engineered for disappearance. The dual machinery of killing and hiding operated with the same administrative precision, revealing a regime that understood the magnitude of its actions and sought to preempt accountability. In examining this final operational stage, we confront a sobering reality. Genocide often carries within it an attempt to control future narratives, to obscure evidence, and to deny victims even the dignity of acknowledgement. Treblinka stands as a testament not only to industrialized murder but to the failed effort to erase it, a reminder that truth, though delayed and contested, can emerge from beneath even the most deliberate attempts at concealment. Chapter 8, Segment 3: The Landscape After Silence. When Treblinka II was dismantled in late 1943, what remained was not simply an empty field, but a carefully engineered silence. The gas chambers had been torn down, wooden barracks disassembled, watchtowers removed, and sections of fencing stripped away or burned. The ground itself was leveled, graves opened and incinerated, ashes scattered and mixed with soil. A farmhouse was built on the former campgrounds, livestock brought in, crops planted, all intended to create the illusion that nothing extraordinary had ever stood there. To an outsider passing along a rural road, the site might have appeared as any other stretch of Polish countryside. Yet beneath that surface lay layers of disturbance: disturbed earth, crushed bone fragments, microscopic ash particles embedded in sand. The forest still held its shape, but its memory had been violently altered. This transformation from active extermination site to staged rural normalcy marked the final operational phase of Treblinka, the deliberate attempt to convert atrocity into invisibility. The SS leadership who oversaw this process were not improvising. They were implementing a broader strategy already applied at other Operation Reinhard camps. Treblinka, like Belzec and Sobibor, was to leave no enduring architectural evidence of its function. It would become a blank space on maps, a void in administrative charts. But what they could dismantle physically, they could not fully erase structurally. Railway schedules still recorded arrivals. German administrative correspondence referenced deportations. Surrounding communities had observed the continuous movement of trains and the persistent smoke rising above the trees. And most critically, survivors, though few, carried knowledge that could not be plowed under. In the months following the uprising of August 1943, several escapees managed to reach partisan units or hide in nearby towns and forests. Their testimonies would later reconstruct the internal geography of the camp with astonishing precision. They described the undressing yard, the camouflaged pathway to the gas chambers known as the tube, the engine that supplied carbon monoxide, the sorting barracks where confiscated belongings were processed, and the cremation pits that replaced mass graves. These recollections became living blueprints of a site that the perpetrators had attempted to delete. When Soviet forces entered the region in 1944, they encountered no intact gas chambers, no rows of barracks, only an altered landscape. Yet investigative commissions soon began gathering testimony and examining the soil itself. Excavations revealed human remains despite the burning operations. Fragments of bone and ash surfaced when the ground was disturbed. The attempted erasure had been incomplete not because it lacked planning, but because its scale had outpaced its capacity for total concealment. Treblinka had processed hundreds of thousands of people in just over a year. The physical traces of such volume could not vanish entirely. In the immediate post-war years, documentation of the camp relied heavily on survivor accounts and captured German records. Trials of former SS personnel and auxiliary guards pieced together the chain of command, confirming that Treblinka had operated as a centralized extermination facility under Operation Reinhard, coordinated through administrative offices in Lublin. These proceedings underscored an uncomfortable truth. The dismantling of the camp had not been a final act of panic, but an extension of bureaucratic logic. Orders to exhume and burn bodies were documented. Construction of the farmhouse was deliberate. Payments and transport records persisted in scattered archives. Even as structures disappeared, paper trails remained in fragments. Over time, public awareness of Treblinka evolved from obscurity to acknowledgement. In the 1950s and 1960s, memorial initiatives began to shape the site into a place of remembrance rather than denial. The symbolic stone monument erected there today does not replicate the camp's physical layout. Instead, it acknowledges absence. Thousands of stone markers represent destroyed Jewish communities, each carved with a name, transforming the ground into a field of memory rather than silence. The design reflects a paradox. The camp was built to annihilate not only lives but evidence, yet its absence now speaks louder than intact walls might have. The surrounding forest, once used to conceal murder, now frames a memorial landscape. Visitors walk across paths that overlay former operational zones, guided not by surviving barracks, but by symbolic markers that outline where gas chambers and cremation pits once stood. The transformation from hidden extermination center to commemorative site illustrates a reversal of intention. What was meant to vanish has become a focal point of historical study and ethical reflection. The soil that once absorbed ash now bears witness through archaeology and memorialization. Scholars have examined the terrain using ground-penetrating radar and other forensic methods, confirming burial pits and burn sites despite decades of attempted concealment. Each discovery reinforces the reality that destruction of physical structures cannot eliminate historical accountability. The narrative of Treblinka's final phase is therefore not solely about the end of operations, but about the struggle over memory itself. The SS sought to write the camp out of existence, to convert mass murder into rural anonymity. But testimony, documentation, and physical traces resisted that erasure. The survivors who escaped carried fragments of knowledge that later converged into a coherent reconstruction. Investigators assembled scattered records into chronological clarity. Historians mapped the camp's layout using converging accounts. In doing so, they reversed the intended trajectory of concealment. Treblinka, once engineered to function efficiently and then disappear, became instead one of the most extensively documented extermination sites of the Holocaust. The attempt to silence it ultimately amplified the imperative to remember. The landscape after dismantling thus becomes part of the structural story of the camp. It reveals that genocide does not conclude with the final killing. It extends into efforts to control narrative and perception. Treblinka's operators understood that history would judge them, and they acted accordingly. Yet history, though delayed, proved more resilient than the wooden barracks and barbed wire fences that once defined the site. Today, when visitors stand in the quiet clearing where the camp once operated, they encounter not the original structures, but the weight of absence, an absence shaped deliberately by perpetrators and reclaimed deliberately by memory. The final transformation of Treblinka from functioning extermination center to concealed field to memorial landscape completes the structural arc of its existence. It began as a blueprint of industrialized killing. It ended as a failed attempt at erasure. And in that failure lies its enduring significance. Even when perpetrators dismantle walls and scatter ashes, the patterns of organization, testimony, and evidence remain recoverable. Treblinka was built to process death efficiently and to leave no trace. Instead, it stands in history as proof that systems designed for secrecy can be reconstructed, that landscapes altered by violence can be studied, and that memory can outlast deliberate silence. Chapter 9, Segment 1, Aftermath. The system continues elsewhere. When Treblinka II ceased operations and its structures were dismantled, the machinery that had created it did not dissolve. It merely shifted form and location. The camp had been one component of Operation Reinhard, the coordinated extermination program targeting the Jewish population of occupied Poland. Its closure in late 1943 coincided with the winding down of that operation as a whole, following the uprisings at Treblinka and Sobibor and the earlier dismantling of Belzec. Yet the administrative personnel, the methods perfected, and the ideological framework that had enabled mass murder did not vanish with the leveling of the site. Many of the SS officers and auxiliary guards associated with Treblinka were reassigned to other camps or absorbed into different sectors of the Nazi security apparatus. Some were transferred to the Italian theater, where German forces occupied northern Italy and began deporting Jews there. Others were redeployed within the Reich or into anti-partisan units. The extermination of European Jewry did not end because one camp was erased. It continued through different infrastructures, most prominently at Auschwitz-Birkenau, which had by 1944 become the central hub of mass deportation and killing. Treblinka's operational model, rapid processing, deception upon arrival, confiscation of property, and elimination without registration, represented a phase in the evolution of genocide that would inform later practices even as technology and scale shifted. In examining the aftermath of Treblinka's closure, it becomes clear that the camp functioned not as an isolated anomaly, but as a node in a larger administrative network. The deportation lists that once fed its rail spur were redirected. Communities not yet emptied were targeted through continued roundups and forced transports to remaining extermination centers. The bureaucratic offices in Lublin that coordinated Operation Reinhard were gradually dissolved. Yet the personnel within them did not disappear. They carried institutional knowledge with them. This continuity challenges any interpretation of Treblinka as a singular episode. It was, instead, a concentrated expression of policies already embedded within the Nazi state. As the war turned decisively against Germany in 1944, the regime's focus shifted from expansion to containment and concealment. Camps closer to advancing fronts were evacuated. Prisoners forced westward in brutal marches intended to prevent liberation and witness. Although Treblinka itself no longer held inmates by that stage, the memory of its uprising and dismantling shaped SS responses elsewhere. Officials became increasingly preoccupied with secrecy and the destruction of evidence. Documentation was burned, crematoria demolished, and mass graves exhumed in other locations as well. Yet the logistical demands of a collapsing war effort strained these efforts. Railways were bombed, communication lines fractured, and coordination weakened. In this environment, the remnants of Operation Reinhard became harder to conceal. Survivor testimony began circulating among resistance groups, and reports reached Allied governments about extermination processes in occupied Poland. While precise details were initially fragmented, the broader reality of systematic murder could no longer be entirely suppressed. The aftermath of Treblinka, therefore, unfolds on multiple levels: institutional, geographical, and psychological. Institutionally, it marks the transition from one phase of extermination to another, demonstrating how the Nazi regime adapted methods rather than abandoning them. Geographically, it reflects the shifting centers of genocide from eastern Poland to camps deeper within German-controlled territory. Psychologically, it reveals the regime's growing awareness that its crimes might eventually be exposed. The dismantling of Treblinka was both an act of concealment and an acknowledgement of vulnerability. Within the camp's former perimeter, silence replaced noise, but beyond it the machinery of persecution continued operating. In the cities and ghettos still under occupation, deportations resumed toward other destinations. In Hungary in 1944, for example, the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Jews to Auschwitz occurred with unprecedented speed, illustrating that the structural principles refined in Operation Reinhard remained active. The absence of Treblinka did not signify the cessation of genocide. Rather, it marked a consolidation of killing processes in fewer, more centralized sites. For historians, this period complicates linear narratives of closure. A camp can end physically while the system that created it persists. Understanding Treblinka's aftermath thus requires attention to continuity rather than rupture. The personnel who staffed it carried experience into subsequent assignments. The economic exploitation embedded within the confiscation and redistribution of property continued feeding the Reich's finances. Even the language of deception, promises of resettlement, fabricated transit explanations, persisted in later deportations. The techniques honed at Treblinka had demonstrated a grim efficiency. They became part of institutional memory. At the same time, cracks in that system widened as military defeat loomed. Morale among guards declined, discipline faltered, and corruption increased. Some officials attempted to distance themselves from direct involvement in extermination activities, anticipating potential accountability. Others doubled down, participating in further atrocities during evacuations and reprisals. The regime's collapse would eventually expose these contradictions, but in the months following Treblinka's dismantling, uncertainty coexisted with continued brutality. The camp's physical erasure did not erase its function from the broader chronology of the Holocaust. Instead, it became a chapter within a larger arc, a demonstration of how quickly mass murder could be organized, how methodically it could be concealed, and how seamlessly it could be redirected when circumstances demanded. In the forests where Treblinka once stood, the machinery had fallen silent. Yet elsewhere, trains still moved, bureaucrats still stamped papers, and guards still enforced orders. The aftermath of Treblinka is therefore not a quiet epilogue but a continuation of the system under new configurations. It illustrates the adaptability of genocidal policy and the persistence of ideology even as physical sites vanish. By tracing this continuity, we understand that Treblinka's story does not end with its dismantling. It extends into the shifting geography of destruction that defined the final years of the war. Chapter 9, Segment 2, Memory Under the Soil, Rediscovery and Testimony. When the last SS men left Treblinka and the final structures were torn down, the regime believed the forest would finish the work of erasure. Pine trees were planted where barracks once stood. A farmhouse was constructed over ground that had swallowed tens of thousands. Paths were leveled. Ash was scattered and mixed with sand. The intention was simple. If nothing remained visible, perhaps nothing would remain provable. Yet memory does not vanish as easily as timber and brick. Beneath the soil lay layers of physical evidence, and beyond the clearing lived those who had escaped, survivors whose testimony would gradually rebuild what had been destroyed. In the immediate post-war years, Treblinka was not as widely recognized as other camps that Allied forces had liberated intact. There were no towering gates captured on film at the moment of discovery, no stacks of emaciated prisoners greeting advancing soldiers. Instead, investigators encountered an empty field marked by uneven ground and scattered fragments. The absence itself became the first clue. Polish commissions began gathering statements from local residents who had seen trains arrive and smelled the constant smoke. Survivors who had fled during the uprising in August 1943 came forward to describe the internal layout. The reception area, the undressing barracks, the camouflaged path known among prisoners as the tube, the gas chambers hidden behind fences woven with branches. These testimonies, given separately and often years apart, converged in remarkable detail. Through memory, the camp's architecture reassembled itself. Legal proceedings in the late 1940s and especially in the 1960s forced further reconstruction. In West Germany, trials against former Treblinka personnel relied heavily on survivor accounts because so few written records had survived. Courtrooms became spaces where erased geography was mapped in words. Witnesses described the sequence of arrival. The shouting, the beatings, the forced stripping, the cutting of hair, the movement through narrow corridors towards sealed chambers. They recalled names of guards, the cadence of commands, the rhythm of daily selections among forced laborers. The precision of these recollections countered denial narratives that sought to exploit the camp's physical absence. In parallel, historians pieced together fragments from railway schedules, confiscated property records, and correspondence between SS offices in Lublin and Berlin. Even bureaucracies that tried to conceal their crimes left traces within financial documents and transport logs. Gradually, a clearer picture emerged. Treblinka II had been one of the deadliest sites of the Holocaust, responsible for the murder of hundreds of thousands within little more than a year. Yet memory work extended beyond courtrooms and archives. Survivors carried psychological landscapes that did not fade with time. Many struggled to articulate experiences that seemed designed to defy language. Silence, for some, became a survival mechanism. For others, speaking was an obligation to those who had no graves. Over decades, memoirs and recorded interviews accumulated, forming a mosaic of individual perspectives. Each account added depth. The sound of engines used to generate carbon monoxide, the fear that accompanied every selection, the moments of quiet solidarity when prisoners shared crumbs or whispered news. These human details transformed Treblinka from abstraction into lived reality. Archaeology, too, eventually challenged the narrative of total erasure. In the early 21st century, non-invasive surveys and limited excavations identified foundations, personal artifacts, and mass grave boundaries beneath the forest floor. Without disturbing burial sites, researchers confirmed structural outlines consistent with survivor descriptions. The earth itself testified. Buttons, keys, fragments of tiles, and remnants of walls contradicted claims that nothing significant had existed there. The soil that the SS hoped would conceal evidence became, instead, a witness. Commemoration followed a complex path. For years, the site remained relatively understated compared to other memorials. Over time, monuments were erected, including symbolic stones representing communities destroyed at Treblinka. Visitors walking among them encounter names of towns that once pulsed with life. The landscape remains quiet, but its silence carries acknowledgement rather than denial. Memory at Treblinka is therefore layered. Survivor testimony, judicial records, scholarly research, and physical remnants converge to reconstruct what was meant to disappear. This process underscores a broader truth about historical erasure. Destruction of material evidence does not eliminate accountability when human memory endures. The Nazis relied on secrecy and speed. They did not anticipate the durability of testimony. Each narrative preserved by survivors counters the intention to reduce victims to anonymity. By documenting names, dates, and procedures, historians restore individuality to those the system tried to erase. At the same time, memory work faces challenges. As generations pass, first-hand witnesses grow fewer. The responsibility shifts to educators, researchers, and institutions to maintain accuracy and context. Denial and distortion persist in various forms, often exploiting gaps in public knowledge. The reconstruction of Treblinka's history, therefore, remains an active endeavor rather than a completed task. It requires continual reaffirmation of evidence and vigilance against simplification. Within this broader framework, Treblinka stands as an example of how truth can survive attempted obliteration. The camp's physical footprint was minimized, yet its historical presence expanded through testimony and scholarship. What was intended to vanish has become one of the most documented extermination sites of Operation Reinhard. The forest no longer conceals but frames remembrance. Walking the grounds today does not reveal barracks or fences. Instead, it invites reflection on absence itself, on how landscapes can be manipulated and how narratives can restore them. The rediscovery of Treblinka was not a single event but an ongoing process spanning decades. It unfolded through survivor courage, judicial persistence, archival research, and archaeological inquiry. Each layer added clarity to the structural breakdown of mass murder that operated there. By examining this process, we recognize that memory is not passive. It is constructed, defended, and transmitted. The attempt to erase Treblinka ultimately failed not because buildings survived, but because witnesses did. Through their voices and through careful historical reconstruction, the camp re-entered global consciousness. Its story, once intended to dissolve into silence, now forms an essential chapter in understanding how genocide was organized and how truth can outlast deliberate destruction. Chapter 9, Segment 3, The Structure of Erasure, How Treblinka Was Designed to Disappear. By the time the last prisoners were forced into columns and marched away from Treblinka in the autumn of 1943, the extermination camp had already entered its final transformation. It was no longer primarily a killing center. It had become a demolition site. Orders from higher SS authorities were clear: dismantle the structures, burn the remaining evidence, scatter the ashes, level the terrain, and remove all visible traces that mass murder had ever occurred there. The same logistical precision that once coordinated train arrivals and gas chamber operations was now redirected toward concealment. Buildings were torn down plank by plank. Bricks were removed and reused elsewhere. Barbed wire fences were taken apart. The gas chambers themselves were destroyed. What could not be transported was smashed, buried, or burned. The intention was not merely to close a camp. It was to erase a crime. Treblinka had operated with ruthless efficiency between mid-1942 and late 1943, murdering vast numbers in a short span of time, and the SS leadership understood that its very speed made it incriminating. Unlike camps that combined labor and imprisonment with killing, Treblinka's sole function had been extermination. There were few long-term prisoners. There was no economic facade to justify its existence. If discovered intact, it would stand as undeniable proof of a system built only for death. And so erasure became the final stage of the camp structure. The process followed a calculated sequence. First, mass graves were opened. Prisoners forced into Sonderkommando units were ordered to exhume decomposing bodies and burn them on open-air pyres constructed from railway tracks and timber. Ashes were crushed and mixed with sand. Bone fragments were pulverized. The air filled with smoke once more, not from newly arrived transports but from the systematic attempt to obliterate the dead. This grim labor continued for months. The workers themselves understood that once their task was complete, they would likely be killed to eliminate witnesses. Some of the urgency that fueled the August 1943 uprising came from this realization. After the revolt, which damaged parts of the camp and allowed several hundred prisoners to attempt escape, the SS accelerated dismantlement. Survivors later recalled how buildings disappeared rapidly, as though the ground were swallowing them. By late 1943, the central killing area had been flattened. Trees were planted to camouflage the site. A farmhouse was constructed and given to a Ukrainian guard, creating the illusion of ordinary rural life. Cattle grazed where gas chambers once stood. The deception was meant to extend beyond physical concealment. Official records referring to Treblinka were minimized or coded. Personnel were reassigned. Administrative trails were obscured. In this way, the extermination camp followed a final blueprint, not only to kill without mercy but to vanish without trace. Yet the architecture of erasure contained weaknesses. The very scale of operation had generated documentation in railway timetables, deportation lists, and confiscation inventories. The coordination between ghettos, transit points, and Treblinka required communication. Even as explicit references were destroyed, peripheral paperwork survived in archives scattered across Europe. Moreover, concealment relied on the assumption that no credible witnesses would remain. The SS underestimated both the resilience of escapees and the persistence of post-war investigators. Villagers living near the camp had seen trains arrive and heard gunfire. Railway workers had noticed unusual schedules. Even the forest retained anomalies. Uneven ground where mass graves lay beneath the soil, fragments of brick and tile surfacing after heavy rain. Erasure proved incomplete because genocide had required too many participants and too much infrastructure to be entirely invisible. The structure of disappearance also reveals something fundamental about the psychology of the perpetrators. The decision to destroy Treblinka acknowledged awareness of criminality. If the regime had believed its actions defensible, there would have been no need to dynamite crematoria or scatter ashes. Concealment demonstrates that the architects of Operation Reinhard understood how history might judge them. They feared evidence. They feared documentation. They feared witnesses. In that sense, the demolition phase becomes part of the structural analysis of Treblinka. It shows that extermination was accompanied by an equally systematic plan to control narrative. Murder and memory suppression were intertwined objectives. The camp was engineered to function efficiently, and it was engineered to disappear efficiently. Both stages required organization, discipline, and coordination. This dual design complicates how we interpret physical absence today. Visitors to the site encounter a memorial landscape rather than original buildings. The emptiness is deliberate, layered over by the perpetrators and then reclaimed by remembrance. When we reconstruct Treblinka's layout, the reception area, the undressing barracks, the camouflage corridor known as the tube, the gas chambers concealed behind woven branches, we are effectively reversing the intended outcome of that erasure. Each diagram, each scholarly study, each educational film challenges the final objective of concealment. The absence becomes evidence of deliberate destruction. The planted trees become symbols of attempted camouflage. The farmhouse built to mask atrocity becomes proof of intentional deception. In this way, the last structural phase of Treblinka, its demolition, completes the analytical circle. The camp began as a site designed for rapid extermination with minimal records and few survivors. It ended as a site designed for rapid disappearance with minimal remains and no visible ruins. But the logic that guided its creation also ensured that it could not be fully erased. Large-scale systems leave traces. Bureaucracies leave paper trails. Survivors leave testimony. The soil itself retains disturbance. The structure of erasure ultimately failed because genocide, despite attempts at concealment, is too expansive to vanish completely. Today, the reconstructed understanding of Treblinka stands not because buildings survived, but because historical inquiry persisted. What was meant to dissolve into forest and farmland has instead become one of the most studied extermination sites of the Holocaust. The Nazis tried to engineer not only death but oblivion. They succeeded in destroying walls and machinery. They failed to extinguish memory. And so the final phase of Treblinka's existence, the attempt to erase it, becomes an essential component of its history. It reminds us that genocide does not end when killing stops. It extends into efforts to deny, distort, and dismantle evidence. To study Treblinka fully is to examine both the machinery of murder and the machinery of concealment. Only by understanding both can we see how the system operated from beginning to end, and how, despite its calculated efforts, it could not make itself disappear. Chapter 10, Segment 1. The Aftermath, Investigations, Testimony, and the First Reckonings. When the killing at Treblinka ended and the camp itself was dismantled, the physical machinery of extermination was reduced to soil, scattered ash, and silence. Yet the end of the camp did not mark the end of its story. It marked the beginning of a new phase, one that unfolded not behind barbed wire, but in courtrooms, archives, interrogation rooms, and survivor testimonies. The collapse of Nazi Germany in 1945 exposed a continent of crimes, but Treblinka posed a unique challenge to investigators. Unlike Auschwitz, where structures stood and thousands of prisoners were liberated, Treblinka had been deliberately erased. There were no intact gas chambers to photograph, no crematoria chimneys rising above the landscape. The perpetrators had intended that absence itself would become a defense. And yet, even without walls, the evidence began to accumulate. Survivors who had escaped during the August 1943 uprising, along with a handful who had fled earlier, became crucial witnesses. Their testimonies described the arrival ramp, the deception of showers, the narrow camouflaged corridor leading to the gas chambers, the screams, the smoke, the burial pits later reopened for burning. These accounts were recorded in displaced persons camps and by Jewish historical commissions in Poland soon after liberation. They provided detailed reconstructions of layout and procedure long before forensic archaeology could confirm them. Meanwhile, Soviet investigators documented sites across eastern Poland as the Red Army advanced. Though Treblinka had been flattened, they gathered fragments of brick, human remains in disturbed soil, and testimonies from nearby villagers who had seen trains arrive daily. The absence of buildings did not prevent recognition of what had occurred. Rather, it sharpened the understanding that destruction had been intentional. In the late 1940s, Polish courts began prosecuting captured guards and collaborators associated with the camp. These early trials established legal acknowledgement that Treblinka had been an extermination center, not merely a labor facility. However, many of the highest-ranking perpetrators had fled or concealed their identities. Some integrated into post-war society under false names. The pursuit of accountability stretched across decades. West Germany, initially slow to prosecute lower-level functionaries, eventually initiated investigations in the 1950s and 1960s. The Treblinka trials held in Dusseldorf between 1964 and 1965 marked a significant moment. Former SS personnel were brought to court, and survivors testified in detail about camp operations. For many in the German public, these proceedings offered one of the first comprehensive exposures to the internal structure of an Operation Reinhard extermination camp. Court transcripts reconstructed the chain of command, the rotation of duties, the number of transports, and the methods used to conceal killings. The legal language of indictments translated survivor memory into formal charges of murder and complicity. Yet justice was partial. Sentences varied. Some perpetrators received relatively light prison terms compared to the scale of their crimes. Others avoided trial entirely. The difficulty lay partly in legal definitions that required proof of individual acts of killing rather than participation in a system designed for mass murder. The bureaucratic nature of Treblinka complicated prosecution. Many defendants argued they had followed orders, managed paperwork, or supervised logistics without personally firing weapons. Courts grappled with how to assign responsibility within an industrialized structure of death. Over time, legal frameworks evolved to recognize that service within an extermination camp constituted participation in murder itself. Beyond courtrooms, historical research deepened understanding of Treblinka's administrative integration within Operation Reinhard. Archival discoveries connected deportation lists from ghettos to train schedules and confiscated property records. Economists and historians traced how valuables stripped from victims entered the German financial system. The camp's operations were revealed not as isolated brutality, but as coordinated state policy supported by ministries, railway authorities, and local administrators. This broader context reframed Treblinka as part of a network rather than a singular anomaly. Memory culture also began to take shape at the site itself. In the 1960s, a memorial was established in Poland, marked by symbolic stones representing destroyed Jewish communities. The absence of original structures became a deliberate element of commemoration. Visitors walked across terrain once engineered for deception and murder, now transformed into a space of reflection. The memorialization process underscored a paradox. Although the perpetrators had attempted to erase the camp, its symbolic presence grew stronger in collective memory. Educational programs, survivor memoirs, and documentaries ensured that Treblinka's name would not fade. For scholars, Treblinka became central to understanding the mechanics of extermination. Its brief operational period, immense death toll, and near-total destruction challenged simplistic narratives of gradual escalation. It demonstrated how quickly administrative planning could translate ideology into systematic killing. The camp structure, arrival deception, immediate gassing, disposal of bodies, recycling of possessions, illustrated an efficiency unmatched in many other sites. As research advanced, demographic studies estimated the scale of victims deported primarily from Polish ghettos, but also from across Europe. The figures underscored the magnitude concealed beneath the leveled earth. Investigators and historians alike faced the task of reconstructing absence. Archaeological surveys in the early 21st century identified foundations and burial pits without disturbing remains, using non-invasive techniques to respect the sanctity of the site. These findings corroborated survivor descriptions and reinforced historical conclusions. In this way, Treblinka's post-war history became a dialogue between testimony, documentation, and physical evidence. Each element supported the others. Each contradicted denial. The aftermath of Treblinka thus reveals a second structure layered atop the first, the structure of remembrance and accountability. Where the camp had once functioned as a mechanism of annihilation, it now functions as a focal point of historical consciousness. The attempt to obliterate evidence ironically strengthened the imperative to document meticulously. Survivors carried memories that courts transformed into legal record. Investigators pieced together fragments into coherent narrative. Educators transmitted knowledge to generations born long after the camp's destruction. This transition from site of murder to site of memory did not occur instantly. It required persistence against indifference and resistance against denial. But over decades, Treblinka became recognized as one of the central extermination camps of the Holocaust. Its story illustrates how even deliberate erasure cannot fully extinguish truth. The final phase of Treblinka's history is therefore not demolition but documentation. Not silence but testimony. And in examining this aftermath, we see how the machinery of concealment ultimately gave way to the machinery of historical reckoning. Chapter 10, Segment 2, Memory, Denial, and the Struggle over Truth. After the trials concluded and the immediate post-war investigations subsided, Treblinka entered a different kind of battleground, not one defined by barbed wire or armed guards, but by memory, denial, and the fragile persistence of truth. The physical camp had been erased in 1943, and in the years that followed, its absence created space for distortion. Holocaust denial movements, emerging decades later, attempted to exploit the lack of standing structures as proof that extermination had not occurred there. They pointed to the absence of gas chamber buildings, the absence of intact crematoria, and twisted this absence into a narrative of fabrication. But historical evidence did not rely on architecture alone. Survivor testimony, transport records, SS correspondence, demographic data from destroyed Jewish communities, forensic soil analysis, and post-war confessions formed an interlocking body of proof. The struggle over Treblinka's memory therefore became a broader struggle over how societies interpret evidence, how they confront moral catastrophe, and how they guard against the manipulation of history. In Poland, where the camp once stood, commemoration took on a solemn and symbolic character. The memorial constructed in the 1960s replaced the camp structures with abstract forms, broken stone slabs, a towering central monument, and hundreds of smaller stones inscribed with the names of towns and cities whose Jewish populations had been annihilated there. Each stone marked not an individual grave, but an erased community. The design reflected the fact that Treblinka had been built to leave no survivors and no graves that families could visit. The landscape itself became a symbolic graveyard. Visitors walked across the ground where gas chambers once stood, where burial pits had been dug and later reopened to burn bodies, where deception had been staged as routine. The absence of reconstructed buildings preserved the starkness of the crime. Meanwhile, historians continued to refine understanding of Treblinka's operation within the broader framework of Operation Reinhard. Research into German administrative archives uncovered additional details about staffing levels, transport scheduling, and the coordination between local authorities and SS leadership. Scholars examined how the camp functioned as part of a system that linked ghettos, rail networks, and confiscation offices into a seamless chain of destruction. This scholarship dismantled myths that Treblinka had been chaotic or improvised. It demonstrated instead that the camp operated with calculated efficiency and bureaucratic precision. The study of Treblinka II contributed to deeper debates about the nature of perpetrator responsibility. Many SS officers who served there were not ideologues at the highest level of policy, yet they executed orders with routine obedience. The camp's history, therefore, became central to discussions about how ordinary individuals participate in systems of extraordinary evil. In educational settings, Treblinka's story was increasingly integrated into curricula not merely as an example of atrocity, but as a case study in administrative genocide. Students learned how deception was engineered, how language disguised killing as relocation, how economic exploitation accompanied mass murder. The camp structure revealed how ideology translated into daily procedure. Survivor memoirs played a crucial role in preserving nuance and humanity within this analysis. Accounts from those who escaped during the uprising described not only terror, but also solidarity, whispered conversations, shared scraps of bread, secret plans drafted under constant surveillance. These narratives countered the dehumanization imposed by the camp. They reminded readers that behind the statistics stood individuals with names, families, and histories. As time passed and survivors aged, preserving these voices became urgent. Oral history projects recorded testimonies, ensuring that first-hand accounts would remain accessible after the last witnesses were gone. At the same time, international awareness of the Holocaust expanded through museums, films, and academic research. Treblinka, once overshadowed by Auschwitz in public consciousness, gained recognition as one of the principal extermination sites. Its death toll, estimated in the hundreds of thousands, underscored its central role in the destruction of Polish Jewry. The camp's near-total erasure became part of its significance. It illustrated how perpetrators anticipated future scrutiny and attempted to preempt it. This foresight revealed an awareness of guilt embedded within the system itself. Denial movements sought to exploit gaps or inconsistencies in early documentation, but each challenge prompted further scholarly rigor. Archaeological surveys conducted with sensitivity to Jewish burial law used ground-penetrating radar and non-invasive methods to map subsurface features. These studies identified foundations of gas chamber structures and locations of mass graves without disturbing remains. The findings aligned closely with survivor testimony recorded decades earlier. In this convergence of memory and material evidence, Treblinka's history solidified against attempts at distortion. Memory culture surrounding the camp also evolved internationally. Commemorations on Holocaust Remembrance Day included references to Treblinka's uprising, emphasizing that resistance existed even within a site designed exclusively for death. The narrative of revolt complicated simplistic portrayals of victims as passive. It highlighted agency and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The uprising did not end the camp's function immediately, but it disrupted its rhythm and forced the perpetrators to accelerate dismantling. This act of defiance became symbolic of moral resistance against annihilation. As the decades advanced, generational distance from World War II introduced new challenges. With fewer survivors alive to speak, historical education relied increasingly on documentation and curated memory. Digital archives made transport lists, photographs, and testimonies accessible worldwide. Scholars collaborated across borders to synthesize data and counter misinformation. The site of Treblinka, preserved as a memorial rather than reconstructed, stood as a silent anchor amid evolving narratives. Visitors encountered not spectacle, but emptiness, an emptiness that required explanation. Guides and educators filled that space with historical context, connecting the bare ground to the machinery that once operated there. The long struggle over Treblinka's truth demonstrates that memory is neither automatic nor permanent. It must be maintained deliberately. Each generation chooses whether to remember or to forget. The Nazis attempted to ensure forgetting by leveling the camp and planting crops over mass graves. Yet the persistence of survivors, investigators, historians, and educators ensured that forgetting would not prevail. The story of Treblinka thus extends beyond 1943 and beyond 1945. It lives in archives, in court records, in memorial stones, and in classrooms. It exists in the tension between denial and documentation, between erasure and remembrance. And in that tension, the camp's final chapter continues to unfold, not as a place of annihilation, but as a testament to the resilience of historical truth. Chapter 10, Segment 3, The Meaning of Treblinka. In the end, Treblinka leaves no walls to walk through, no preserved barracks to enter, no looming gates to photograph, and that absence is itself the final lesson of the camp, because Treblinka was built not to imprison but to eliminate, not to endure but to disappear, and yet it remains one of the clearest demonstrations of how modern systems can be turned toward systematic annihilation. When we step back from the timeline of transports and gas chambers, from the uprising and the dismantling, what emerges is not only the story of a single extermination camp, but the anatomy of a process that converted prejudice into policy, policy into procedure, and procedure into death on a scale that defies comprehension. Treblinka II functioned for barely more than a year at full capacity, yet in that short span it erased entire communities, emptied towns of their Jewish populations, and transformed railway timetables into instruments of extermination, and it did so through organization, coordination, and routine, which is precisely why its history continues to demand careful attention, because it forces us to confront the unsettling reality that genocide does not erupt solely from chaos but can be administered through order. The camp's design reflected clarity of purpose, from the deception platform staged as a transit station to the fenced corridor that funneled victims toward gas chambers disguised as showers, from the sorting barracks where possessions were catalogued and shipped back to Germany to the burial pits later reopened to burn bodies in an attempt to erase evidence. Each component operated within a larger administrative framework that linked local ghettos, German ministries, railway officials, and SS command, and in that web of coordination the responsibility extended far beyond the men who guarded the gates. Treblinka teaches that mass murder required not only ideology but logistics, not only hatred but paperwork, not only violence but scheduling, and it reveals how language can be weaponized to conceal reality, as deportation became resettlement, extermination became special treatment, and killing became processing, euphemisms that shielded participants from confronting the meaning of their actions. Yet even within this machinery of deception and destruction, moments of human choice persisted, and the uprising of August 1943 stands as proof that even in a place engineered for silence, defiance could emerge, that prisoners stripped of rights and reduced to numbers could still organize, plan, and act, not because they expected survival but because they refused to accept total erasure, and that act of resistance altered the camp's trajectory, disrupting operations and contributing to the decision to dismantle the site. When the Nazis plowed over Treblinka and planted crops to disguise the ground, they believed they had secured impunity, but the memory carried by survivors, the transport records preserved in archives, and the demographic void left in hundreds of towns ensured that the truth would surface, and the absence of buildings became an absence that demanded explanation. Today, the memorial at Treblinka stands not as reconstruction but as representation, stones marking lost communities rather than individual graves, a landscape of silence that invites reflection rather than spectacle, and in that silence the enormity of what occurred becomes more apparent, because nothing distracts from the scale of loss. Historians continue to analyze the camp not only to document its operation but to understand its place within Operation Reinhard and the broader evolution of the Holocaust, tracing how early experiments in killing escalated into centralized extermination centers and how Treblinka became one of the primary sites where Polish Jewry was annihilated. This analysis is not an academic exercise alone but a safeguard against distortion, because denial often exploits the very efficiency with which the Nazis erased evidence, and rigorous scholarship counters that exploitation by assembling testimony, forensic research, administrative documents, and comparative studies into a cohesive narrative that withstands scrutiny. Treblinka's history also invites reflection on moral responsibility, challenging the assumption that such crimes are carried out only by monsters isolated from society, and instead showing how ordinary individuals, embedded within bureaucratic structures, can participate in extraordinary crimes when obedience, conformity, and ideology converge. The camp story therefore extends beyond its physical boundaries and beyond the years 1942 to 1943, reaching into discussions about modern institutions, state power, and the fragility of ethical norms. It reminds us that systems are shaped by human decisions and that each procedural step, however small it may appear, contributes to outcomes that can either uphold dignity or destroy it. The legacy of Treblinka is not solely one of horror but also of warning, a reminder that vigilance requires understanding how incremental policies accumulate into catastrophic consequences. As the generation of survivors passes, the responsibility for memory shifts increasingly to educators, historians, and communities who must preserve the narrative with accuracy and care, ensuring that the camp is remembered not as an abstract symbol but as a real place where real people lived, suffered, resisted, and died. The final lesson of Treblinka may lie in its stark contrast between design and remembrance, between a site engineered for disappearance and a history that refuses to vanish, because despite the Nazis' efforts to conceal it, Treblinka endures in archives, in scholarship, in memorial stones, and in collective conscience. And so when we conclude this examination, we do so not with spectacle but with recognition, recognizing that Treblinka was a system, that systems are built by choices, and that the preservation of its history is itself an act of resistance against forgetting, a commitment to ensure that the mechanisms of organized cruelty are studied, understood, and never allowed to operate unchecked again. Final outro. Treblinka II. The extermination camp explained. Treblinka was designed to leave nothing behind. No buildings, no witnesses, no trace. And yet, history remains. What stood in that forest was not chaos. It was a system engineered, organized, scheduled. A place where trains arrived on time, where paperwork was filed, where deception was rehearsed, and where human lives were reduced to numbers in ledgers. Understanding Treblinka is not about revisiting horror for its own sake. It is about understanding how ordinary structures, railways, offices, orders, routines, can be turned toward extraordinary evil when morality is removed from the process. That is why we study it carefully, quietly, completely, because memory is the opposite of erasure. If this documentary helped you understand Treblinka more clearly, consider supporting the channel by subscribing. These films take time, research, and care, and your support helps keep detailed historical storytelling alive. Subscribe for more full-length Holocaust and World War II documentaries, and help ensure these histories are never reduced to silence. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.